It's 1999, and Japanese nuclear scientists Hisashi Ouchi, Masato Shinohara, and Yutaka Yokokawa are conducting routine work. Within seconds, two of those men would be doomed to die, and Hisashi Ouchi would receive the greatest dose of radiation any human being has ever experienced. The men are mixing together a batch of fuel to be used in a fast breeder reactor, a special type of nuclear reactor which can create more fissile material than it consumes. These reactors are typically used to aid in nuclear research, as they can very quickly and efficiently create large quantities of nuclear material to fuel conventional reactors. The men are experienced nuclear scientists, but a series of miscalculations and outright mistakes would doom two of them to die the most horrible deaths one could imagine. Ouchi is standing next to a large metal tank, to which he's adding a mixture of various chemicals and 16 kilograms of uranium. Behind and above him, Shinohara stands on a platform overlooking the work, while 4 meters away, Yokokawa sits at a desk busying himself with paperwork. As Ouchi begins to pour the mixture into the precipitation tank, he doesn't realize that the tank has a maximum uranium limit of 2.4 kilograms. Ouchi dumps the entire mixture into the tank regardless, and as he does, he sets in motion one of the worst civilian nuclear accidents in history. The walls of the tank reflect neutrons being released by the uranium atoms, which causes the wayward neutrons to bounce back and strike other uranium atoms and split them, releasing even more neutrons. Under a normal uranium limit, not enough uranium atoms are present to sustain a nuclear chemical reaction. But Ouchi has just unknowingly dumped so much uranium into the tanks that within nanoseconds, the precipitation tank becomes a fully working nuclear reactor. Almost as soon as Ouchi finished pouring the fuel mixture, there's a blinding flash of blue light caused by the emission of Cherenkov radiation. The men stagger backwards, blinded and dazed as the gamma radiation alarms begin blaring. Ouchi is blasted with an incredible 17 sieverts of radiation, or a whopping 300 times the annual dose allowed for nuclear plant engineers, and more than twice what's believed to be a lethal dose. Ouchi has just been bombarded with as much radiation as if he'd been standing at the center of an atomic explosion. Masato is further away, but he still receives an incredible 10 sieverts of radiation, guaranteeing his death. Yutaka, who is 4 meters away, however, only receives a 3 sievert dose, 5 below the lethal limit. Ouchi, though, will suffer a fate no human being in history has ever experienced. As the radiation tears through his body, it completely destroys all of his chromosomes, making him the only human being ever to live with no DNA in his body. The radiation almost completely destroys all of his white blood cells and covers most of his body in third-degree burns. The radiation is so intense that it even burns the skin on the side of his body facing away from the tank. Ouchi is so disoriented by the radioactive blast that he immediately vomits into the precipitation tank and then manages to stagger backwards. Helping each other, the three men barely manage to stumble into the decontamination chamber, where Ouchi immediately passes out. The men are rushed to the local hospital, and treatment begins to try and save their lives. Ouchi is in critical condition and is flown to a better-equipped hospital in the Chiba prefecture. By the time he gets there, his skin is almost completely fallen off his body, and with no skin, any fluids he receives quickly leak out from his pores. Just to keep him hydrated, Ouchi has to be given fluids by IV 24/7, with the majority of those fluids simply leaking out of his body and soaking the bed. The doctors treating Ouchi know that he will not survive. No living being could possibly survive the radiation dose he just suffered. They make a controversial decision, though, and decide that whether Ouchi likes it or not, he is now going to serve as a guinea pig for treating radiation illness. This is, after all, a once-in-a-lifetime medical opportunity. To try and restore his white blood cells, he's given a transplant from his sister, who is a willing donor. At first, this seems to work, and Ouchi's white blood cell count starts to recover. However, his body is so poisoned by radiation that his own flesh destroys the new white blood cells. Completely helpless to infection, Ouchi is quarantined and sealed off from the world in a special suite. During this time, Ouchi fades in and out of consciousness. 5 days after the accident, he comes to. His wife is able to see him briefly, and blood is leaking from his eyes. He begs the doctors to let him die. He doesn't want to live in pain anymore. He tells them that he's not a guinea pig. The doctors respond by putting him into a medical coma. Their experiments are not over, and the doctors pump blood into Ouchi just as fast as he's losing it. He receives as much as 24 transfusions a day, and desperate for results, the medical team treating him begin to use drugs imported from all around the world. But his body is so damaged by radiation, they have no effect. 27 days after the accident, Ouchi's body begins to disintegrate from the inside out. He's been unable to regrow new skin, and in a bid to keep him from losing liquids through his body's pores, he's been wrapped in linen bandages. Daily skin transplants are being done, yet the transplants simply won't take and slough off. The muscles of his body start to peel off his bones. Inside his body, his organs begin to simply come apart as Ouchi liquefies from the inside out. At this point, Ouchi is nothing more than a skeleton with a few inches of flesh attached to it. His body has decomposed so much that his right foot has simply fallen off right below the knee joint. 59 days into the ordeal, Ouchi's heart stops, and yet the doctors resuscitate him 3 times over the course of 49 minutes. This severely damages his brain, which is likely a mercy. Ouchi is likely too brain damaged to regain consciousness again. Finally, on December 21, 1999, Ouchi dies of organ failure, his body simply unable to continue the basic processes of life despite being put on life support. Shinohara would last 4 months more than Ouchi, and was even thought to be recovering. On New Year's Day, he was able to visit the hospital gardens with the assistance of a wheelchair. However, the radiation had damaged him too severely, and slowly his own body began the process of shutting down. In February, he contracted pneumonia, and because of the damage done to his lungs by the radiation, he was unable to breathe on his own. The doctors hooked him up to a ventilator, taking away his ability to speak. Shinohara was forced to resort to writing messages on a pad of paper to his nurses and his family. But as time went on, he grew weaker and weaker. Finally, on April 27th, Shinohara too died of multiple organ failure, the radiation claiming him as well. One of his last messages, scrawled on the hospital notepad, was simply, "Mommy, please." Yokokawa would go on to make a recovery, and 6 months after the incident was released to recover at home. However, a year later, an official investigation would charge him and 5 others with criminal negligence in the incident. Public anger would lead to major reforms of the facility, as it was revealed that the experimental plant routinely cut corners and ignored safety rules. For Ouchi though, the man who suffered the greatest radiation dose in history, those changes would come far too late. April 26, 1986, 1:23:04 a.m. Technicians in the control room at Chernobyl nuclear power plant sit at their stations. The concrete room is cool, the air damp. "Initiating safety test now," one of the operators says. The fuel rods begin to shift in nuclear reactor unit 4. Suddenly, there is a power surge in the core. A siren begins to blare in the control room. Red lights flash, casting a blood-red glow across the faces of the men in the chamber. An uncontrollable chain reaction is initiated in the nuclear reactor. One of the operators sprints over to a control panel and slams his fist against the emergency shutdown button. The control rods jam as they proceed toward the core. 54 seconds after the test is initiated, there is an explosion. In 1977, Soviet engineers and workers constructed 4 RBMK nuclear reactors at the site that would become the Vladimir Ilyich Lenin nuclear power plant. After the disaster, this facility would simply be known as the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. By the following year, one of the reactors would be brought online, and in 1984, the plant would have 4 active reactors, with a 5th under construction. Each of the reactors was capable of producing around 1,000 megawatts of electric power. Chernobyl sits just south of the Belarus border in Ukraine and is about 65 miles or 104 kilometers north of Kyiv. On April 25, 1986, at 1 in the morning, the operators at Chernobyl reduced the power being sent to reactor number 4 as they prepared to run a safety test on the system. This was done at the same time that routine maintenance was being carried out. The test itself would determine if the still spinning turbines of the reactor could continue to produce enough electricity to keep the coolant pumps operating if there was ever a complete loss of power at the plant. This information needed to be ascertained in order to surmise whether the gap between a power loss and the time it took for the emergency generators to kick in would result in a nuclear meltdown or catastrophic failure. At 2 p.m. that day, the cooling system was disabled, so the test could be run without any interference. The tampering with the coolant system was not disclosed to some of the incoming operators during the shift change, which would have been information needed in the moments before the core went critical. As the day progressed, the test was pushed further and further back to make sure it did not interfere with the power needs of the surrounding towns. Reactor 4's power levels were kept around 1,600 megawatts while the team waited for the appropriate time to start the experiment. At 11:10 p.m., operators at Chernobyl received word that they could continue the experiment. However, the shift change was about to happen, so rather than starting the test in the middle of a shift change, the shutdown was delayed once again. At midnight, the new shift came in. They were less experienced and had not been properly briefed or trained on what should be done during the test. This would lead to catastrophic mistakes in the hours to come. Just after midnight, the power of reactor number 4 was lowered to 720 megawatts. The reactor was not designed to go below 700 megawatts for a sustained period of time. But for some reason, most likely due to poor oversight and training, the night shift operators at Chernobyl were unaware of this safety measure. At 12:28 a.m. on April 26, the reactor reached 500 megawatts. The local control system switched over to the automatic regulating system as energy output became dangerously low. In order to remedy the situation, the operators scrambled to remove many of the control rods in the reactor, which directly violated the safety guidelines at the power plant. This decision did not have the desired effect. A buildup of xenon on the core caused the power levels to drop even further. Either due to human error or a malfunction in the system, the reactor's output fell to 30 megawatts. By 1 a.m., the team had managed to raise the power output of the reactor number 4 to 200 megawatts. This was still below prescribed levels, but it seemed as if the core had stabilized for the moment. The deputy chief engineer and acting supervisor at Chernobyl, Anatoly Stepanovich Dyatlov, decided that the test could recommence. In preparation for what was to come, he ordered the automatic emergency shutdown system and power regulating system to be turned off. Water flow was increased to the core while additional cooling pumps were activated. This decreased the heat in the system and led to low reactivity, which necessitated the need to remove more control rods so the reactor could continue to run at 7% power for the next several minutes. Due to a buildup of pressure in a steam drum, the order was given to increase feed water flow into the core. This further reduced the number of nuclear reactions occurring in the system and caused automated safety measures to kick in and remove several more control rods. The operators and engineers conducting the experiment continually ran into pressure and reactivity issues for several more minutes. However, around 1:23 a.m., all systems seemed to finally stabilize. Dyatlov ordered the commencement of the test. At 1:23 and 4 seconds a.m., reactor number 4 began to run as planned. This process would take about 30 seconds. At 1:23:40 seconds a.m., pressure began to build in the core once again. A series of warning lights started to flash. One of the operators initiated an emergency shutdown, but several control rods jammed as they entered the core. An out-of-control chain reaction began in the reactor. At 1:23 and 58 seconds a.m. on April 26, 1986, the chain reaction reached critical levels, and there was an explosion in reactor number 4. This was immediately followed by a second explosion that blew the 1,000-ton roof off the structure and shot a fireball into the sky, briefly illuminating the surrounding area as if it were the middle of the day. The explosion in reactor number 4 caused a massive disruption in energy output. Power fluctuated throughout the power plant. The explosion ejected hundreds of tons of irradiated dust into the air as chunks of radioactive graphite hurtled across the area. Radiation began to spew out of the exposed reactor like smoke rising from a volcano. The entire complex rocked from the explosions, but the operators in the control center continued to operate as if reactor number 4 was still intact. Several engineers insisted that there had been a catastrophic failure and that all evidence pointed to a partial meltdown in the core. However, the initial reaction of Anatoly Dyatlov was to continue operating the nuclear power plant as if nothing was wrong, even though one of the reactors had just exploded and was releasing radiation and debris into the atmosphere. This led to slow response times from the personnel working in the control room, while emergency crews who could see the explosion from miles away began rushing to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant to get the flames under control. At least 28 people were killed in the initial explosion, and 100 more were seriously injured out of the 600 workers present at the power plant that night. 134 of them, including the operators running the test gone wrong, received between 0.8 and 16 grays of radiation, or about 80 to 1600 rads. This high dose of radiation resulted in all of them developing radiation sickness soon after the accident. 28 died within 3 months of the reactor exploding. At 1:28 a.m., the first firefighters arrived at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant. The facility was being consumed by several fires raging across the complex. Other than personnel trying to escape the flames, these firefighters were the first people exposed to the lethal doses of radiation pouring out of the exposed reactor after the initial explosion. They had not been warned of the dangers they were walking into. The firefighters did not wear any protective clothing nor take any precautions to mitigate their exposure to radiation as they rushed into the nuclear power plant, trying to save as many lives as they could. At 2:15 a.m., almost an hour after the reactor blew up, local Soviet officials were briefed on the compromised nuclear power plant. They decided to set up roadblocks along the main entry points into and out of the nearby city of Pripyat, which had been built to house the Chernobyl workers and their families. Even though the local officials knew that a catastrophic event had happened, they were not given information on the extent of the damage, the danger the exposed core presented, or that the population in the surrounding area should be evacuated. Therefore, all personnel assisting with the roadblocks, including police and military officers, had not been warned about the true extent of the dangers the power plant posed. Like the firefighters who were on the front lines, these first responders proceeded closer to the Chernobyl power plant without any protective gear. For the remainder of the night into the early morning, emergency personnel continued to provide any form of aid they could, exposing themselves to high doses of radiation. The fire in reactor number 4 continued to rage. In order to increase safety measures and to make sure no further reactor failures occurred, officials ordered that reactor number 3 be shut down at 5 a.m. and reactors 1 and 2 be shut down a few hours later. However, all 3 remaining reactors would be reopened in the coming months, even as the true nature of the disaster was discovered by the rest of the world. The last of the fires that had spread through the complex were finally extinguished at 6:35 a.m. However, the inferno burning in the core of Reactor 4 was unreachable without emergency personnel receiving deadly doses of radiation. Emergency personnel had already been in the building to put out fires and rescue any survivors, and anyone who stepped foot near the exposed reactor core would die of radiation poisoning in the coming months. This posed a significant problem for Soviet leadership. Nuclear engineers and scientists from across the Soviet Union who were consulted about the Chernobyl disaster warned the leadership that as long as the core was exposed and the fire continued to burn in its core, more and more radioactive material would be spewed into the air and sweep across the region. The Soviet Union wanted to keep the extent of the Chernobyl disaster quiet for as long as possible, and therefore suppressed information going into and coming out of the area. However, they needed to get the fire in the core under control, or eventually the radiation levels would be so high that there would be no hiding what had happened. At 10 a.m. on April 27th, the Soviets began flying transport helicopters loaded with sand, boron, lead, and dolomite over the exposed core of reactor number 4. These substances were dropped into the core to suppress the fire and contain some of the radiation. The residents in and around Chernobyl continued to be left in the dark about what was happening at the nuclear power plant. Emergency personnel who had been at the plant and returned home informed their loved ones of how bad things were. The tragic part was that these men didn't just bring home stories. Since no one was ordered to wear protective gear, anyone who was at the power plant was covered in radiation, which they brought home with them, exposing their family and loved ones to the deadly particles that clung to their clothes, skin, and hair. At 2 p.m. on April 27th, 36 hours after the explosion at the nuclear power plant, Soviet officials began evacuating people from the area. They had known how deadly the spreading radiation was long before they ordered the evacuations, but the main priority of the Soviet leadership was to contain the situation first and worry about their people later. The delayed evacuation undoubtedly led to countless unnecessary deaths and illnesses as a direct result of prolonged exposure to radiation. 115,000 people were evacuated from Pripyat or nearby towns on April 27th. The government continued to lie and withhold information from everyone who was in danger at the time, along with the rest of the world. The residents who had been evacuated were told it would only be temporary and they would be returning to their homes in the near future. This was a lie, and the Soviet leadership knew it. Nuclear experts had already informed them that the Chernobyl power plant and the surrounding region would remain irradiated for years to come. Even still, residents were told to only grab important documents and belongings, along with any food they could carry. Only days later, an exclusion zone was set up around Chernobyl. It extended 18.6 miles or 30 kilometers from the nuclear power plant and incorporated around 1,017 square miles or 2,634 square kilometers. However, this exclusion zone would later be expanded to include 1,600 square miles or 4,143 square kilometers to encompass several heavily irradiated areas outside the initial zone. No unauthorized personnel would be able to enter. In fact, the exclusion zone is still in place today. Anyone who was evacuated on April 27th would never see their homes again. Many would also die premature, horrible deaths as a result of radiation exposure from the meltdown at the power plant and the subsequent slow response of the Soviet government to evacuate non-essential personnel. On April 28, 1986, 2 days after the nuclear reactor at Chernobyl exploded, Swedish air monitors detected a large amount of radiation coming from the south. The source of the radiation was traced back to the USSR. It could not be determined immediately where the radiation was coming from, and the silence of the Soviet Union made the Swedes extremely suspicious. If they were detecting the radiation, it must have meant that the Soviets were aware something within their border was releasing an enormous amount of irradiated particles in the atmosphere. The Swedish government immediately contacted the Kremlin for answers. Like with everything else during the Chernobyl disaster, the Soviets were slow to respond. Eventually, they informed the Swedes that there had been an accident. They did not elaborate or provide any further relevant information, but one thing was for sure. Since the radiation levels reaching Sweden were so high, it had to mean something extremely bad was going on within the Soviet borders. The Kremlin informed the Swedish government that everything was under control when nothing could be further from the truth. The exposed core of Reactor 4 was still ejecting huge amounts of radiation into the atmosphere, and it would not stop anytime soon. The following day, U.S. spy satellites confirmed what many had feared all along. The damage that the Chernobyl power plant had sustained was much worse than the Soviets were letting on. Reactor 4 was completely exposed, and around 30% of the power plant's 190 metric tons of uranium was being ejected into the atmosphere. If the Soviets didn't get the reactor fire under control and contain the radiation leak soon, neighboring nations might be facing their own crisis in the near future. It was not clear how far the radioactive particles would drift, so other countries in the region began taking precautions. On May 4th, a new set of containment crews started to work at Chernobyl and began pumping liquid nitrogen underneath the reactor to cool it down. 800,000 workers began the arduous job of containment and cleanup around the power plant. They needed to remove any contaminated debris that had been blown off the structure as the initial explosions ripped through the facility. Entire villages near the power plant were bulldozed, and any animals present in the exclusion zone were shot on sight. This included dogs, cats, livestock, and wildlife. Any radioactive rubble or waste was buried deep underground, which included the top layer of soil. Around 4 square miles in the exclusion zone became known as the Red Forest due to the reddish-brown color the leaves of trees had turned as they died from high amounts of radiation absorbed by their cells. Further away from the nuclear power plant, where the radiation levels were slightly lower, everything looked to be just fine. But when Geiger counters were brought in, it was found that radiation covered everything, and it would only be a matter of time before living things like plants and animals would show signs of radiation poisoning. Then on May 6th, the radioactive emissions being discharged from reactor number 4 decreased dramatically. This was most likely due to the fire in the core finally burning itself out, as up to this point, the Soviets were still having trouble dousing the fire in the reactor. As more and more people learned of the true extent of the disaster, the Soviet Union decided to take steps to protect its citizens. The Kremlin ordered officials in Kyiv to close schools and advised their citizens to stay inside. People were warned against consuming leafy greens and told to refrain from eating vegetables grown in the area until it could be confirmed they were free of radiation. In the future, it would be determined that the amount of radioactive particles released into the atmosphere far exceeded the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This demonstrated the danger that nuclear power plants could pose if not properly managed or without adequate safety measures in place. The radionuclides that were released from the destroyed reactor were mainly iodine-131, cesium-134, and cesium-137. Each of these radionuclides posed their own problems. Iodine-131 had a relatively short half-life of about 8 days. However, it could easily get into the human body through breathing contaminated air, consumption of leafy greens, or ingesting dairy products. If consumed this way, the iodine would then begin to build up in the thyroid gland. This posed a significant risk to infants and children who were ingesting large amounts of milk and dairy in their diets. The fact that their thyroid gland is smaller and children tend to have a faster metabolism than adults means that the radiation levels increase more rapidly. The United Nations Scientific Committee on the Effects of Atomic Radiation conducted a research study that concluded more than 6,000 children and adolescents developed thyroid cancer as a direct result of the Chernobyl disaster. This has been disputed by some, but there is no denying the fact that young children were much more vulnerable to radiation due to their diet and physiology. On May 8th, containment crews drained the last of the radioactive water that was located under the core. Unfortunately, much of the contaminated water had already flooded parts of the complex and leaked into soil around the reactor. Altogether, the workers removed around 20,000 tons of radioactive liquid and buried it in an undisclosed location around the exclusion zone. Once this was completed, the engineers at Chernobyl could start building the containment structure that would finally contain the last of the radiation being discharged from the core. To do this, they poured concrete under the reactor to serve as a foundation of what would become known as the sarcophagus. Unfortunately, like many of the things that had led up to the Chernobyl disaster, corners were cut, and experts were either ignored or never consulted. Even after the sarcophagus was well underway, many nuclear scientists and engineers pointed out that the sarcophagus was structurally unsound, which turned out to be painfully true in the years to come. The containment structure would need to be repaired several different times, and eventually an entirely new structure would need to be built to encase the crumbling sarcophagus. While the concrete was being poured for the original structure, radioactive debris was continuously being buried at around 800 different locations in the area. Again, due to incompetence and gross negligence of the Soviet leadership, many of the sites were not recorded properly, and it's likely that contaminated material could be located in unknown spots all around Chernobyl. Of the 800,000 workers who struggled to contain the radiation and removed radioactive debris and built the sarcophagus around the reactor, approximately 300,000 received 120 millisieverts of radiation, which is about 12 rads. A millisievert is the maximum limit of radiation an average member of the public should receive in a year. At sea level, people receive around 0.27 millisieverts, while at higher altitudes, populations tend to receive closer to 0.5 millisieverts from background radiation. Therefore, these workers received 500 times the radiation they would have if they had not been at Chernobyl. To put this into perspective, a CT scan typically hits a patient with around 9 millisieverts. So the workers at Chernobyl received over 10 times as much radiation as a CT scan for the duration of the time they worked at the site. This greatly increased their risk of developing cancer and other radiation-induced illnesses. On May 14, 1986, Mikhail Gorbachev, then president of the Soviet Union, made a public announcement for the first time about the disaster at Chernobyl. This was likely due to the increasing pressure from the international community and the ability to keep the Chernobyl disaster quiet any longer. It's unclear when or if the Kremlin would have acknowledged what happened at the nuclear power plant if Sweden and the United States didn't have evidence that forced their hand. Gorbachev promised the people of the Soviet Union and the world that the worst was over, but his words were meaningless, as for many their problems had just begun. Most of the radiation was carried east or north by wind currents, leading to radioactive particles being blown into Belarus, Russia, and across Ukraine. However, as weather patterns shifted, some of the radiation released from the Chernobyl disaster made its way to western France and Italy. Millions and millions of acres of land were doused with radiation across Europe, including forests, farmlands, and water sources. Even though people around the power plant and in the exclusion zone had been evacuated, many others were still in danger of receiving at least some radiation, and depending on their bodies, it could be enough to make them seriously ill. In the years following the Chernobyl disaster, a significant percentage of livestock were found to be born deformed or with birth defects. One study discovered that around 33.5% of barn swallow chicks in the exclusion zone showed signs of abnormalities, while 17.8% of the adults showed signs of some sort of genetic alteration. The radiation from the disaster was affecting plants, animals, and humans. No one was safe from the radiation that had escaped from the exposed reactor. In late August 1986, the International Atomic Energy Agency held a conference where scientists and engineers examined the accident at Chernobyl and concluded it was the result of human error and a lack of adequate safety procedures. It was also found that there were several serious problems with the Soviets' reactor design that needed to be remedied if they hoped to avoid another catastrophe in the future. Hundreds of thousands of people needed to be relocated or protected from the initial fallout of Chernobyl. Subsequent studies concluded that the land immediately around the power plant would not be habitable for the next 20,000 years due to the high radioactivity in the area. However, this did not deter the Soviets from turning reactors 1, 2, and 3 back on, even as cleanup efforts continued and the area around the power plant pulsed with radiation. Workers and operators were sent back to the facility to ensure that the Soviet Union had the energy it needed. Many around the world could not believe the Soviets had turned on a system that only months before had a meltdown. But this is exactly what happened. Chernobyl continued to produce power for the next several years, even though another disaster could have been looming just over the horizon. Even after decades of study, it's still hard for scientists and doctors to measure the amount of damage the mistakes made at the Chernobyl power plant in 1986 have done. Most reports conclude that somewhere around 30 people died immediately after the explosion as a direct result of radiation exposure while combating fires, moving radioactive debris or trying to get the blaze in the core under control. However, in the years following the initial disaster, as many as 4,000 people may have died from radiation-related cancers. Another 5,000 could still be at risk of developing similar illnesses, even though they may have received a lower dose of radiation. Millions of people in the former Soviet Union and around Europe also suffered both mental and physical trauma as a result of being evacuated and forced to flee their homes during the crisis. There's also the very real possibility that the disaster might play a role in genetic diseases or abnormalities found in future generations born to parents who were at or near Chernobyl when it was spewing radioactive particles into the atmosphere. Interestingly, after several years, the wildlife and plant population in the exclusion zone did begin to recover. Without further human encroachment or destruction of the natural habitat in the area, elk, roe deer, wild boars, lynx, birds, and other wildlife have returned, and their numbers continue to grow. In fact, scientists have estimated that there are around 7 times more wolves in the exclusion zone than in the surrounding reserves. That being said, there are elevated levels of cataracts, albinism, and other genetic defects present in these populations. Chernobyl and the exclusion zone serve as an interesting case study on how reduced human activity in an area can influence wildlife populations. Even plants and trees have begun to regrow in the region, and although they too show signs of genetic alterations from radiation, the ecosystem itself is thriving. It's unclear if unexpected problems will arise in the wildlife populations in the future due to generations of prolonged exposure to high levels of radiation, but as of right now, the exclusion zone ecosystem seems to be flourishing without a human presence to disrupt it. However, the USSR did not fare so well. The Chernobyl disaster took a huge economic and political toll on the Soviet Union. It also made the general public incredibly wary about using nuclear power or living anywhere near a nuclear power plant. The repairing of Chernobyl, the containment effort, and the relocation of over 100,000 people are estimated to have cost the Soviet Union around $235 billion. What is now Belarus, but was a part of the Soviet Union at the time, lost 20% of its agricultural land and approximately a quarter of its total territory to contamination. In 1991, Belarus spent around 22% of its annual budget on disaster response efforts to clean up and decontaminate the land affected by the Chernobyl disaster. That same year, Chernobyl Unit 2 was shut down after a fire broke out in the building. The reactor was unaffected, but the close call led to it being ultimately shut down and never turned back on. In 1996, reactor number 1 was also shut down. For the next 4 years, reactor number 3 continued to operate and produce electricity for the area. Then, on December 15, 2000, 14 years after the disaster that left much of the surrounding area covered in high levels of radiation, the final reactor at Chernobyl power plant was shut down, and the facility was officially decommissioned. In 2016, the new safe confinement structure was completed and then moved into position over the sarcophagus housing reactor number 4. Over the years, there had been several radiation leaks detected in the old structure, as it was never meant to contain the reactor indefinitely. The new safe confinement structure will keep the core of reactor number 4 contained for the foreseeable future. The structure that's in place today was the result of an international design competition, in which the French companies Vinci Construction Grounds Projects and Bouygues Travaux Publics won a €432 million contract. Later, they would hire the Dutch company Mammoet to help with the movement of the new safe confinement structure into position over the reactor. Containment efforts and cleanup of the surrounding area of Ukraine are slated to continue until 2065. As of 2019, 11 RBMK reactors are still operational in Russia. It's not clear what precautions, if any, have been taken at these other nuclear power plants to ensure that the same type of catastrophe that happened at Chernobyl doesn't happen again. But since the Kremlin remains untrusting of outsiders, and the leadership doesn't seem to be nearly as concerned about public safety or the well-being of their people as they are about invading neighboring countries, there's a good chance that one of these nuclear power plants could suffer a meltdown in the future. When the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, Ukraine gained control of Chernobyl and the land around it. In 2011, the Ukrainian government opened Chernobyl and the abandoned city of Pripyat to scientists and tour groups. Today, no one lives or is allowed into the exclusion zone without permission from the government. And since Ukraine is currently fighting a war against Russian invaders at the moment, no new permits are being given out. Terrifyingly, a battle did break out around Chernobyl, and many were concerned that the containment structure would be breached during the fighting. This is a perfect example of how Putin and his regime have very little regard for the safety or lives of their own soldiers. It's unclear what the future of Chernobyl will look like once the war is all over, but it seems that the Kremlin has no plans to improve its track record around public or nuclear safety anytime soon.
Nuclear Armageddon. For years it haunted the daily lives of millions of Americans and Russians, only to be all but forgotten at the end of the Cold War. But with hostilities mounting once more between the US and Russia, and the announcement of a possible pullout from a strategic arms treaty by the US, the old specter of nuclear war is once more looming over a new generation. But how much do you really know about nuclear weapons? Hello and welcome to another episode of the Infographics Show. Today we're taking a look at 50 terrifying facts about nuclear weapons. 50. The largest nuclear weapon in the U.S. stockpile has a yield of 1.2 megatons, or 1,200,000 tons of TNT. 49. Compare that with the 15 kiloton, or 15,000 tons of TNT equivalent of Little Boy, dropped on Hiroshima during World War II. 48. Most of the uranium used in the Little Boy and Fat Man nuclear bombs came from a single mine in what is today the Democratic Republic of the Congo, shipped to the U.S. by a Belgian mining firm. 47. 3 different manufacturing plants were used in developing the Fat Man and Little Boy nuclear weapons, so that no one plant would have the complete designs. 46. Because if exposed to water, the uranium components of the first nuclear bombs would release huge amounts of radioactive contamination, pilots were strictly warned that in emergencies they must crash their planes on land and not the sea. 45. In the Little Boy bomb, less than a kilogram of the 64 kilograms of enriched uranium actually underwent nuclear fission, and of that mass, only 0.6 grams were transformed into kinetic and heat energy and radiation. 44. A timer on the first nuclear bombs ensured that they would not detonate until at least 15 seconds after release, giving the aircraft time to get to a relatively safe distance. 43. The chain reaction of nuclear material leading to a nuclear detonation lasts less than 1 microsecond. 42. Disobeying orders, the weaponeer of the Enola Gay was concerned that Little Boy could detonate accidentally if the Enola Gay crashed on takeoff, and thus removed the conventional explosives to help the uranium achieve critical mass from the weapon. He only replaced them once the aircraft was safely up in the air and on her way to Hiroshima. 41. At 8:15 a.m. on the 6th of August 1945, the Enola Gay dropped the first nuclear weapon ever used in war on Hiroshima, killing 66,000 people, 20,000 of which were Imperial Japanese Army soldiers. 40. Claimed to have been used to avert a more catastrophic invasion of Japan, it's widely thought Japan would have surrendered to the US soon anyways, as it faced a massive Soviet fleet preparing to invade just across the Sea of Japan. Senior Japanese officials all knew it would be better to surrender to the US than the Soviet Union. 39. Hiroshima was selected as a target for nuclear bombing in April 1945 and spared the conventional bombing that Japan suffered throughout the rest of the countryside. This was so that the effects of a nuclear bomb on an undamaged city could be fully observed. 38. A second plane escorted the Enola Gay and dropped a suite of instruments by parachute at the same time that the Little Boy atomic bomb was dropped. These instruments relayed via radio data to help engineers determine the total yield and effectiveness of the bomb. 37. The fiery blast from a nuclear bomb is the result of local air being superheated by X-rays and sending out a pressure wave in all directions. 36. The fireball from the Hiroshima bombing was 1,200 feet in diameter and had a surface temperature of 10,830 degrees Fahrenheit. That's hotter than the surface temperature of the sun. 35. Shadows from people near the epicenter of the blast at Hiroshima were permanently burned into the sides of buildings and the pavement. 34. The Hiroshima bombing created a firestorm 2 miles in diameter. At Nagasaki, a southwest wind pushed fires away from the city and didn't let them become so severe. 33. The true death count of victims at Nagasaki and Hiroshima were impossible to calculate, as many victims and all evidence they had ever lived were immediately vaporized or cremated by the fires. 32. Surprisingly, there was little radioactive fallout from either the Nagasaki or Hiroshima blasts. Fallout is typically created from dust and ash from a bomb crater that is contaminated with radioactive products from the bomb. But because both bombs were air bursts, there was no bomb crater and little radioactive fallout. 31. When a nuclear bomb is airbursted over a target, the vast majority of the radioactive products rise into the stratosphere and dissipate into the global environment. 30. Despite there being little if any local fallout, an intense burst of neutron and gamma radiation was emitted by the little boy in Hiroshima bombs, with a lethal radius of about 0.8 miles. 29. To date, no radiation-related evidence of heritable diseases has been observed amongst the survivors of the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings. 28. The Smithsonian Institution displayed a complete little boy nuclear bomb, minus the enriched uranium, until 1986, when the Department of Energy took the weapon from the museum to remove its inner components so that it couldn't be stolen and detonated with fissile materials inside it. Its outer casing was later returned for display. 27. The first detonation of a nuclear weapon in history was at 5:29 a.m. on July 16, 1945 in New Mexico. 26. Producing the fissile isotopes uranium-235 and plutonium-239 for use in just a few bombs was so difficult that it took up 80% of the entire Manhattan Project's budget. 25. Without the technological breakthroughs of the Manhattan Project, producing just 1 gram of enriched uranium would have taken 27,000 years. Maybe it would have been best if they had failed. 24. The security detail at the Trinity test site where the first atomic bomb was tested originally brought horses to help patrol the vast desert, but the distances proved too great and instead resorted to jeeps. The horses were kept so the soldiers could play polo when off duty. 23. The base camp at the Trinity test site was accidentally bombed twice because of its proximity to a bombing range and its secrecy, but with no casualties. 22. The scientists at the Trinity test site worked out of a ranch house that had been bought by the government when it acquired the land. The master bedroom of the house was then turned into a clean room for assembly of the core of the first nuclear bomb. In that bedroom, at least, is literally where the boom boom happened. 21. 160 men and their vehicles were on standby outside the first atomic test in order to evacuate the surrounding region of civilians should disaster happen. The soldiers had enough food and supplies to last the civilian population 2 days, and the governor of New Mexico was warned that martial law may have to be declared, though he wasn't told why. 20. The men at the test site were ordered to lie on the ground with their backs turned to the bomb during the test, but scientist Edward Teller ignored this and wore sunglasses under his welding goggles and brought suntan lotion to share with a few others who also insisted on observing the test directly. 19. Scientist Enrico Fermi offered to take wagers among the military and scientists on whether the test would ignite the atmosphere, and if it did, whether it would destroy only the state or incinerate the entire planet. This was a joke, but calculations indicated there was a tiny chance that such a scenario could happen, and for a long time it seriously concerned all the scientists involved. 18. The Trinity test bomb melted desert sand around it into a mildly radioactive light green glass, which would be named Trinitite. 17. Keith Bainbridge, one of the scientists of the Manhattan Project, said just after the successful test, "Now we are all sons of bitches." Robert Oppenheimer, head of the project, said that he thought of a verse from the Hindu holy book, the Bhagavad Gita, "Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds." 16. A pilot flying a U.S. Navy transport to the west coast and just north of the test site thought for a moment that the sun was rising in the south when the bomb detonated. He had no idea what he had just seen, and when he reported the explosion over the radio, he was simply warned not to fly south. 15. The government covered up the Trinity test by telling civilians in the vicinity that what they had witnessed was just a depot full of explosives and pyrotechnics accidentally exploding. 14. The results of the Trinity test were relayed in code immediately to President Truman, who was at the Potsdam Conference in Germany, with the message reading, "Operated on this morning, diagnosis not yet complete, but results seem satisfactory and already exceed expectations. Local press release necessary as interest extends great distance." 13. In August of 1945, the Kodak company discovered spotting and fogging on their film caused by exposure to radioactive elements. The problem was tracked to the cardboard used in the containers, which came from a paper mill in Indiana, and a hotspot of fallout that had contaminated the river water the mill used. 12. In 1951, the U.S. government gave Kodak and other photographic companies maps and forecasts of potential contamination, along with expected fallout distributions, so they could purchase uncontaminated materials for their boxes and protect their stocks of film. 11. In 1961, a U.S. Air Force B-52 broke up in midair over Goldsboro, North Carolina, and released 2 hydrogen bombs. Neither detonated upon hitting the ground, but if they had, each one would have had 260 times the destructive power of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. 10. Colorado, Montana, Nebraska, North Dakota, and Wyoming are home to the U.S.'s entire ICBM fleet, which lie in missile fields that span several square miles each. 9. In the 1950s, the U.S. developed a tactical nuclear weapon which weighed 51 pounds and could be fired from the back of a Jeep. It was named the Davy Crockett and was meant to be used against Soviet tank forces in Germany. 8. Just 8 kilograms of plutonium are needed for a nuclear weapon. Something many intelligence and security agencies around the world fear is well within the reach of major terror groups. 7. 11 nuclear bombs have been lost by the U.S. in accidents and never recovered, all of them in the ocean. 6. If under nuclear attack, the U.S. president would have just 12 minutes to order a counterattack before incoming missiles destroyed the bulk of U.S. forces. 5. At any one time, 12 Ohio-class ballistic missiles are actively patrolling the world's oceans, ready to unleash their nuclear arsenals in the case of war. 4. The United States protects 31 nations with its nuclear umbrella, all of NATO, Japan, South Korea, and Australia. A nuclear attack against any of these nations will elicit an immediate response by the U.S. 3. The U.S. maintains 200 B-61 nuclear gravity bombs deployed at forward bases in Europe for use by U.S. and NATO air forces. 2. During the Cold War, the U.S. maintained up to 950 nuclear weapons in South Korea. 1. Since 1945, there have been 520 atmospheric nuclear explosions, with 8 of them being underwater, for a total yield of 545 megatons, and 1,352 underground explosions for a total yield of 90 megatons. Many of us have been lucky enough to grow up without Cold War fears of a nuclear holocaust happening at any moment. And though the international climate today is far better than it was back then, simmering hostilities are threatening to boil over. To add to our problems, the advancement of technology and the proliferation of enrichment technology around the world has made it easier than ever for a terrorist group or criminal organization to simply build their own nuclear weapon. Though full nuclear war may be avoided, the risk of nuclear terrorism is at an all-time high, prompting a famous reply from the U.S. intelligence community that it's a wonder it hasn't happened yet.
There's a bright flash of light. You instantly go blind. After a second, you begin to sweat, your skin begins to burn, you feel as if you're being cooked alive. Your cells begin to denature as the heat intensifies. Blood leaks out of your ears. You feel an intense pain like nothing you've ever experienced before. After a few moments, it's all over. Your internal organs give up as a mushroom cloud rises to the sky and blocks out the sun. The distance you are from a nuclear explosion and the type of nuclear explosion determine what will happen to your body when the bomb goes off. All nuclear explosions will have the same kinds of effects on the body. However, it's the size and power of the bomb that influences the radius at which people will experience certain effects. For the sake of argument, we'll assume a 1 megaton nuclear bomb is detonated in your vicinity. This benchmark will be used to help identify the distance at which certain dangers take place. But make no mistake, nothing good comes out of even the smallest nuclear explosions. A nuclear explosion is created by splitting or fusing atoms together. In a 1 megaton bomb, both nuclear fusion and fission are happening. When these processes are triggered, the bomb releases an enormous amount of energy all at once. This creates a gigantic fireball, a powerful shockwave, and a massive amount of radiation. So what would happen to your body if you were approximately a mile away from a nuclear explosion? When the bomb detonates, it releases all of its energy at once. The moment the explosion is initiated, the temperature and pressure around a mile from the blast site will skyrocket. The temperature can get hotter than the core of our sun and exceed over 15 million degrees Celsius. The intense heat causes a fireball to erupt into the sky and incinerates anything within the surrounding area. If you were standing somewhere within a mile of the nuclear explosion, every cell in your body would instantly be torn apart to its basic elements. The temperature would be so intense that the bonds between atoms would be broken, and the atoms that made your body up would be ejected into the sky. The carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, and other elements that once made you would mix into the fireball. Death would come swiftly, and you would no longer exist in your current form. You would survive slightly longer if you were standing between a mile and 3 miles away from a nuclear explosion. However, the explosion would still kill you at this radius, just in a different way. Although you wouldn't be incinerated or completely vaporized at this distance, your body will receive a massive amount of thermal heat and radiation. It would be so intense that seconds after the bomb detonated, your skin would begin to burn. We're not talking about a slight burn like you'd get after spending the day at the beach. We mean your body would burn, as if you were in the middle of a bonfire. The cells throughout your body would begin to denature, and you would develop third-degree burns across your body. Soon after the explosion, your skin would change color, and blisters would break out across your body. During this time, you would feel excruciating pain until all of the nerve receptors throughout your body were destroyed. Unfortunately, this could take several minutes. If you were 2 to 3 miles away from where the bomb went off, you would feel yourself being cooked alive until you either went into shock or your vital organs shut down. Your skin cells would initially turn red as they received massive doses of radiation, but would eventually blacken. Blisters would pop while blood and pus oozed out. You would lose liquids at an astonishing rate due to burns, which would also be one of the contributing factors to your death. Within your body, your vital organs would begin to boil, and even though they're not exposed directly to the rapid change in temperature around you, the cells that make up your heart, lungs, and other vital systems would quickly die. Third-degree burns would even occur inside your body due to intense radiation. This would only increase the amount of pain your body would have to endure. Eventually, the extreme heat and high level of radiation would lead to internal bleeding, and only minutes after the nuclear explosion, you would be dead. If you did somehow survive, you would be praying for death. At some point, your lungs would rupture, your heart would cease beating, and your brain would literally begin to melt. However, since your body would go into shock after 24 to 30% of it was covered in third-degree and second-degree burns, you would pass out long before your internal organs were burnt to a crisp. If you were far enough away to not die immediately from your burns, there would be a good chance that the fires breaking out all around you would consume you in flame. If you were trapped in a building that caught fire, the smoke from the burning wood and other materials would cause you to asphyxiate. As the smoke and radioactive particles filled your lungs, you would struggle to breathe in oxygen. Your cells would not be able to carry out respiration to make energy. Without this vital process, your cells instantly begin to die. You would be simultaneously poisoned and asphyxiated. Regardless of if you were able to seek shelter and endure the initial nuclear explosion, an unseen killer would still be lurking around you. It's this terrifying aspect of a nuclear blast that would kill any survivors in the area. Radiation is one of the deadliest threats to the human body after a nuclear explosion occurs. Unfortunately, just because you survived the thermal heat from the nuke doesn't necessarily mean you're in the clear. If you were within 3 miles of the blast site, you could receive a dose of radiation high enough to immediately cause symptoms of radiation sickness. The DNA in your cells would be torn apart, and as your cells tried to repair each strand, mistakes would be made, resulting in mutations. This would cause basic cellular functions to cease. Proteins that are vital for almost all life processes would be drastically changed by the radiation, resulting in changes in shape. Without the appropriate proteins carrying out their functions, your body would not be able to maintain homeostasis. Cells would begin replicating uncontrollably, which would result in numerous cancers enveloping your body. Cancer itself is the uncontrolled division of your own cells, and unfortunately, the radiation given off by nuclear explosions almost always results in cancer if the dosage is high enough. It's the damage that the radiation causes to the DNA in your cells that causes them to replicate nonstop. However, with the amount of radiation entering your body, you would be long dead before the cancer would kill you. If you were located somewhere between 3 and 6 miles away from the nuclear explosion, the effects on your body become a bit more complicated. You may live longer, but due to certain symptoms that would arise, you might find yourself wishing the initial blast consumed you. The very real threat to your body at this distance is death by flying debris. When the bomb detonates, everything in the vicinity will be instantly superheated and vaporized, causing a massive change in air pressure. This pressure change results in a shock wave that could travel over 150 miles per hour. The closer you are to the blast, the stronger the wind speeds will be. In some cases, the wind could be traveling more than 450 miles per hour, which is enough to blow you off your feet and slam you into whatever's behind you. In this situation, your bones would snap, and you die from blunt force trauma. As the wind forces your body to fly through the air, you'll eventually connect with a solid structure or hit the ground. If you hit your head, the force will shatter your skull, sending shards of bone into your brain, causing instant death. A less merciful way to go would be if your body is slammed into the ground and your own bones puncture your internal organs, causing you to bleed internally, which would eventually induce organ failure and death. At distances further than 3 miles away, you likely won't get swept off your feet, but there's still the danger posed by flying debris. At these speeds, shards of metal, glass, or wood could still hurtle through the air uncontrollably. If anything solid hits you at 150 miles per hour, it would cause serious damage, especially if it's sharp and you're impaled by something like a flying signpost or a sharp branch. Depending on what the nuclear blast flung in your direction and where it hit your body, you could die from blood loss. A less deadly but still destructive side effect of a nuclear blast is called flash blindness. When a nuclear bomb detonates, a large amount of energy is also given off as light waves. These are so intense that anyone looking toward the explosion when it occurs will temporarily or permanently go blind. This phenomenon can affect people that are up to 10 miles away from the blast. The intensity of the light given off by the explosion is increased at night when your retinas are enlarged to naturally take in more light so you can see better. This means that if the bomb goes off when it's dark, the effects of flash blindness can be heightened. The massive amount of high-intensity light waves entering your retina oversaturates the retinal pigment, which in turn means the light entering your eyes can't be resolved into an image and sent to your brain. The further away you are, the less likely you are to go permanently blind, but it isn't a guarantee. Although flash blindness is not fatal, the side effects can be. For example, if you happen to be driving a car when the nuclear bomb goes off and you temporarily become blind, you could smash into an oncoming car, and that would be the end of your story. Similarly, if you were blind after a nuclear explosion, your chances of getting to safety are greatly reduced. And when it comes to treating burns, radiation sickness, and any injuries caused by the blast, urgency is key. But your eyes are not the only part of your body that'll be damaged due to changes in the physical world. When the blast goes off, you may not only experience blindness, but you could go deaf as well. You'll undoubtedly see the bright light from the detonation before you experience anything else associated with the explosion. This includes sound. Nuclear explosions are often depicted as noiseless catastrophes where there's a bright flash of light and a mushroom cloud of destruction. However, in reality, nuclear explosions are excruciatingly loud. If you're within 5 miles of the blast zone, it'll take a few seconds for the sound of the explosion to reach you, but it's coming. The pressure change as a result of the explosion will be around 5 pounds per square inch, which is enough to rupture your eardrums. This wouldn't necessarily be life-threatening, but it would make conversing with other survivors and emergency responders more difficult. You might have a constant ringing in your head where everything could go completely silent. At the same time, your balance would be thrown off, resulting in serious problems when trying to reach safety. There is a different byproduct of a nuclear explosion that doesn't appear to have a huge impact on your body, but could cause you some serious problems. When a nuclear bomb detonates, it releases an electromagnetic pulse outward in all directions. An EMP caused by a nuclear explosion is the result of molecules in the air becoming superheated and ionized. The ionized particles move outward and fry any electronic device they pass through. Your brain and nervous system use electrical signals to communicate with the rest of your body. There doesn't seem to be any effect on local brain processes when someone's exposed to an EMP blast, but it's unclear if there are any long-term implications that we just don't know about yet. What we do know is that animals, like certain migratory birds, rely on Earth's magnetic field to help them navigate and can be greatly impacted by an EMP. The EMP can throw off the mechanisms they use to not only fly in the right direction, but keep from slamming into one another. It might seem far-fetched, but falling birds could pose a serious risk to your health in the aftermath of a nuclear explosion and the subsequent EMP blast. However, that EMP could be deadly to certain people. If you are someone with a pacemaker that keeps your heart beating, you would be in a bad spot if you were within 5 to 10 miles of the explosion. This is the reach an EMP could have, resulting from a large nuclear explosion. A pacemaker has sensors and circuits that monitor heart rate and provide electrical stimulus to the vital organ as needed. However, an EMP would completely fry such a device. In such a situation, the heart would be left to beat on its own. For many people who have pacemakers, their heart isn't strong enough to properly pump blood and nutrients around their body. If you have a pacemaker that becomes disrupted by the EMP released by a nuclear explosion, you would feel a heaviness in your chest as your heart strains itself to keep you alive. This tension would eventually result in a heart attack for most people. If you're someone who relies on monitors to regulate brain function, you would also be negatively affected by the EMP, as any neural stimulus would cease to function. This also includes anyone who is hooked up to a life-sustaining device in hospitals around where the nuclear explosion occurred. These people would begin to flatline moments after the blast, as all these medical devices would be disrupted by the EMP. The EMP released from a nuclear blast may not directly affect the body itself, but it would be deadly for many people in the surrounding area. The number one hazard to your body created by a nuclear explosion is radiation. Unfortunately, the fallout from a nuclear detonation can extend for miles and miles, meaning even if you are far away, a nuclear explosion can still affect you. There are 2 ways that your body can be exposed to radiation from a distance. The first way is externally, which happens when the irradiated particles are forced outward from the epicenter of the explosion and rip through your skin and body. External exposure is especially dangerous when you're close to the nuclear blast. However, it's the second type of exposure that can have long-lasting consequences for your body and may lead to a life of misery. Internal exposure occurs when you inhale particles that have been irradiated from the nuclear explosion. As discussed before, when the bomb goes off, it vaporizes anything in the vicinity, while also pushing huge amounts of debris into the atmosphere. All the dirt and other particles ejected into the sky are wildly radioactive. The mushroom cloud and smoke that results from a nuclear explosion also contains radiation as well. It's these particles that will eventually coalesce and drop back down to Earth. Unfortunately, those small dust particles can be inhaled, and once in the lungs, can cause serious complications to the rest of your body. The irradiated particles you ingest can infect your cells, causing lung cancer later in life. However, they can also get absorbed into your bloodstream and circulate around your body, wreaking havoc on numerous body systems including the liver and kidneys. If you're over 10 miles away from the blast site, you probably don't have to worry too much about being incinerated or being hit by flying debris. But contamination by radiation is definitely something you should be aware of. This is true even if you're wearing a mask or other PPE to protect you from inhaling irradiated particles, because radiation can find other ways into your body. For example, the food you eat and the water you drink might also contain radiation from a nuclear explosion. If you ingest contaminated food, the radiation enters your digestive system. You could develop stomach, colon, or intestinal cancers, all of which are life-threatening. If you ingest contaminated water, those particles will likely make their way around your entire body and could infect cells in several different organs. The biggest threat radiation causes is cancer. Even if you're far away from a nuclear blast, the particles that enter your body can still cause this disease. And although it may not be immediately life-threatening, the effects of radiation will make the coming years miserable as your body literally destroys itself. If the cancer cannot be contained, you could die as a result of ingesting only a small amount of contaminated food, water, or air. Nuclear fallout can travel great distances depending on weather conditions. This means a nuclear explosion could harm your body even if you're nowhere near where the bomb went off. It's estimated that fallout can travel well over 10 miles on strong wind currents. However, on average, the further away from a blast site you are, the lower the concentration of contaminated particles falling from the sky will be. Far-reaching fallout is the result of vaporized particles from the initial blast being carried away by the wind. As the air cools, these particles clump together and fall to the ground. What it obviously comes down to is that the closer you are to a nuclear explosion, the more likely you are to die. Obviously, if you're close enough to be vaporized with everything else, you will not feel any pain. However, if you survive the initial blast, your body is going to take a beating due to extreme changes in temperature, pressure, and the amount of radiation entering your body. When you pass a nuclear power plant in the distance as you drive down the road, it's impossible not to think about the power that those towering buildings hold. Scientist Enrico Fermi supervised the opening of the first nuclear reactor in 1942, and now our landscapes are dotted by mighty nuclear power plants. These powerful energy plants provide over a fifth of the United States' electricity and don't have the carbon footprint of other energy sources like coal and fossil fuels. So why not build more? One reason: nuclear waste and radioactivity. When managed correctly, nuclear power plants are processing powerful radioactive energy that needs to be disposed of correctly to keep the environment and the people handling it safe. And if someone wasn't handling the planet's safety correctly, like a certain bald bumbler from Springfield, things could go very badly. The risks of nuclear energy become crystal clear in 1979 in Londonderry Township, Pennsylvania, at the 3 Mile Island nuclear plant. While the reactors were stable, a failure in the mechanical systems regulating the safe venting of gases broke down and allowed a large amount of nuclear reactor coolant to escape. That led to a partial meltdown of Reactor 2, creating a major radiation leak near the city of Harrisburg. A voluntary evacuation of a 20-mile radius around the plant followed. Thankfully, no one in the plant was injured, and later tests showed no increased risk of cancer. But it took 15 years to clean up the surrounding area. It remains the worst nuclear accident in United States history, but is dwarfed by the massive nuclear meltdown at Chernobyl, which caused major casualties and rendered areas surrounding the Ukrainian plant uninhabitable to this day. Given the risks, it's no surprise that nuclear waste and byproducts are strictly regulated by the government. Modern nuclear plants keep waste to a minimum by recycling used fuel back into the uranium-based and mixed oxide fuel, but 4% of nuclear waste can't be processed and remains highly radioactive. radioactivity is a waiting game as the toxic quality of the waste decreases over time, measured in half-life, or the time it takes for a radioactive substance to reduce to half of its nuclear value. The time it takes for nuclear waste to neutralize varies wildly. Some common isotopes like strontium-90 have a half-life of around 30 years, but other powerful artificial nuclear isotopes like plutonium-239 have a half-life of over 20,000 years. Not only is it radioactive enough to kill anyone exposed to it, but it could be an unpleasant surprise for whoever digs it up in the far future. Nuclear power plants operate in 31 countries, including all of the world's largest economies, and much of Asia and Africa are planning new builds. The regulation of nuclear waste is overseen by the International Atomic Energy Agency's Joint Convention on Spent Fuel Management, and they work to keep the world safe. The risks of exposure to nuclear waste include higher risk of cancer, higher risk of birth defects in pregnant women, and in high concentrations, organ failure and death. Most nuclear waste comes from nuclear power plants and nuclear arms, but medical and industrial waste and natural radioactive materials also pose a risk. Nuclear waste comes from two main sources: front-end and back-end. Front-end nuclear waste comes from the extraction of uranium and contains radium. The depleted uranium that comes from it is extremely dense and is often recycled into anti-tank shells and other metals where extreme durability is needed. Back-end nuclear waste comes from spent fuel rods and is packed with beta and gamma radiation. These powerful energies come with extremely long half-lives and are formed in nuclear reactors. Some of the most challenging waste to dispose of comes from nuclear weapons materials, and the plutonium used to create these powerful bombs is extremely difficult to separate and isolate. That makes nuclear weapon disposal a growing concern, especially in the aftermath of the Cold War, when the US and Russia drastically slashed their nuclear arsenals. The world is less likely to end now, but what are we going to do with all those things that can end the world? The classification of nuclear waste determines the priority level of the processing and disposal. The lowest priority nuclear waste is uranium mill tailings, which are created by the rough processing of uranium ore. While they don't contain a high level of radioactivity, they have long half-lives and are full of metals with other health risks like arsenic and lead. Low-level waste is the most common waste type because it's anything that came into contact with radioactivity. Common in hospitals and processing plants, it can include paper, clothing, tools, and filters that are used by people working with nuclear energy. These objects pick up trace levels of radioactivity and should be disposed of safely instead of being processed with standard trash. Intermediate waste is usually the byproduct of nuclear processing and is harder to dispose of than low-level waste. Resins, chemical sludge, and metal coverings that have been exposed to nuclear energy long-term pick up the harmful radioactivity, and the hazardous nature builds over time. When breaking down a nuclear reactor for decommissioning, even the building materials surrounding the core can build up radioactivity. Before disposing of this waste, it should be safely shielded to prevent exposure. Then there's high-level waste, and this is what everyone thinks about when they hear about nuclear power plants. The alarms start blaring, the hazmat suits go on. High-level nuclear waste is as radioactive as you think, but the good news is there are effective ways to contain it. When a nuclear fuel rod serves its purpose and is taken out of the core, it becomes high-level waste. While the number of high-level waste objects is small compared to the other classes, the level of radioactivity is so high that it accounts for over 95% of total radioactivity caused by nuclear energy. While most radioactive isotopes produced by high-level waste are high-powered but have a short half-life, the presence of isotopes like plutonium makes it critical to ensure it's contained safely. So what's the best way to dispose of nuclear waste? That's what nuclear energy-using countries have been arguing over for decades. Most experts say the best solution for long-term disposal is by constructing a deep underground facility similar to a mine that can contain large amounts of high-level waste away from humans and be sealed up in between disposals. But that's easier said than done, and no country has finished one. Although Finland is close to completing their Onkalo spent nuclear fuel repository on the west coast. Currently, countries use a number of alternative systems that are considered safe but imperfect. The first step to minimize the impact of nuclear waste on the environment is to neutralize it as much as possible. This is done by processing it and stabilizing it into a form that loses its explosive properties. Some countries mix the waste with sugar and then calcinate it into a solid object by processing it through a rotating tube. Turned into glass, the waste products are then bonded to the other molecules and then poured into stainless steel and sealed. They're then stored underground, where the waste products are trapped for thousands of years without leaking radioactivity into the environment. Other technologies include ion exchange, where medium-level wastes are neutralized by concentrating the radioactivity into much smaller volumes. This makes them easier to contain, but isn't recommended with the volatile high-level wastes. But when the time range for nuclear waste to become deactivated can reach into the millennia or longer, with some rare isotopes having a half-life of over 1,000,000 years, scientists are concerned that these storage methods can come back to haunt us. That's why we've eliminated many of the more short-sighted methods of nuclear waste disposal, like ocean disposal. Up until the 1990s, many countries, including the United States and the Soviet Union, would dump drums of contained nuclear waste into the ocean, especially in the coastal regions of Somalia. Somalia hasn't had a functioning government since the 1990s, and the pirates weren't going to mess with a large ship bearing a country's flag when they could go after smaller merchant ships. So countries thought anything goes out there. The Arctic Ocean was also a popular choice for the Soviets, as they controlled a huge coast in the north. Overall, 137,000 tons were dumped in the water by European countries in 34 years, and it took its toll on the oceans. Tests of areas where dumping was common found elevated levels of radioactivity, and in 1993, a treaty was passed banning ocean disposal of nuclear waste. The most common current method for nuclear waste disposal is above-ground disposal, where waste is sealed up in a steel cylinder with an inert gas that won't react with it, and then sealed in radiation-shielding concrete. The radiation-proof drums are then sealed in a storage facility near the nuclear power plant. This is how big plants handle their waste in-house, and it's popular for a few reasons. First, it's handled internally and the plant doesn't have to get approval and fight their way through government red tape to find a dumping facility. Second, it's inexpensive and doesn't require construction or expensive materials. Finally, the waste remains on site for reprocessing, which remains the best solution for solving the nuclear waste question. But the secret weapon for eliminating nuclear wastes is chemists and physicists, as these scientists have developed ways to chemically separate fission products and unused uranium from used nuclear fuel. This started by extracting plutonium, with its long half-life, from nuclear fuel to be used in the construction of nuclear weapons. But as the focus shifted from bombs to energy plants, scientists developed ways to create a new type of nuclear fuel from the remnants of the old. MOX nuclear fuel, or mixed oxide fuel, is created in high-level facilities from nuclear waste coming from plants around the country, and has become a top way of disposing of nuclear waste in Europe. In America, the government's focusing on research, and commercial nuclear fuel reprocessing isn't widespread yet. So what will nuclear waste disposal look like in the future? One of the biggest possibilities is space disposal, as this will get the radioactivity as far away from people as possible. The problem, besides the possibility of poisoning some aliens that will come looking for revenge, is that technology isn't there yet. While technology like mass drivers and space elevators is in development, the carrying capacity of our current space shuttles is limited and would only be able to carry a small amount of nuclear waste. The money that goes into every space shuttle launch is high, and the program is far from foolproof. The loss of the Challenger and the Columbia shuttles proves that a catastrophic accident is possible, and a space shuttle disaster carrying a nuclear payload could contaminate a large area. But could we transform nuclear waste into less harmful waste with a shorter half-life? That was the dream of scientists behind the Integral Fast Reactor, an experimental reactor that would use a nuclear fuel cycle that reprocessed fuel through electro-refining. It would extract almost all the energy contained in uranium, cutting fuel requirements by 2 orders of magnitude. Unfortunately, the design had problems with leaking cooling fluid, and the project was canceled by the US government in 1986. But research is ongoing, and new fission reactors that have much more processing power than the traditional light water reactors are under development now. The Earth itself might be our best ally for disposing of nuclear waste, as man-made structures underground are the top proposal for future storage facilities. By digging out large, stable bunkers in sparsely populated areas of a country, nations could keep their nuclear waste in a centralized location and reduce the risk of leaks happening in multiple locations. Deep borehole disposal is an alternative that creates narrower but much deeper holes capable of storing the waste up to 3 miles under the earth, where any leaks would be far away from humans. The big holdup, besides developing the technology for safe deep earth drilling, getting approval from governments is a holdup. Many countries have rejected proposals out of fears that the disposal won't be safe or that it could destabilize the ground. The consequences of a nuclear accident are massive and long-term, as the residents of Pripyat, Ukraine know all too well. In the heart of the Chernobyl nuclear plant is the Elephant's Foot, a mass of solid nuclear waste caused by the 1986 meltdown. Dense and hard to damage, it was so radioactive when released that it would kill anyone who was in the same room with it. Today, over 30 years later, it's still highly radioactive and poses major health risks to anyone who's exposed. So, however we neutralize our nuclear waste, let's make sure it stays there.
At 6:45 a.m. on March 1, 1954, the Earth rumbled and shook. A massive crater was formed in the Pacific Ocean as the largest hydrogen bomb to ever go off made its fateful detonation. An orange and yellow explosion that could be described as glorious shot up a cloud of radioactive debris that stretched 4.5 miles wide and 130,000 feet high into the sky above Bikini Atoll, a tiny island that's part of the Marshall Islands. It left a crater in the ocean floor with a diameter of 6,510 feet and a depth of 250 feet. Just to give you an idea of its magnitude, that's more than 18 football fields wide and almost an entire one deep. This lethal debris was still falling about 5 hours later on Rongelap, an atoll 97 miles away, where it came down like ashy snow, so naturally, kids played in it and even went so far as to eat it. This is the story of Castle Bravo, the thermonuclear accident that ended up being 1,000 times more powerful than Hiroshima. Castle Bravo was the code name for what was ironically called the Shrimp, a device that weighed 23,500 pounds and was based on the Teller-Ulam thermal nuclear weapon design, named after scientist Edward Teller and mathematician Stanislaw Ulam. Basically, the two set out to create a weapon that could be delivered by an aircraft. Its design was novel because its different parts were linked and each part of the sequence was intended to be powered by the part preceding it. This means that if one of the first elements failed, so too would all of the subsequent stages, rendering the device useless. Sort of a high-stakes dominoes. This design was supposed to be an upgrade from Ivy Mike, a previous bomb model tested in 1952 that had to be the size of a small building to support the equipment that allowed its fuel to stay in necessary liquid form. So, not convenient at all. Bravo used solid lithium deuteride, which meant none of this clunky equipment was necessary for it to retain its form. Bravo was the first part of Operation Castle, a mission that spanned 2.5 months and was the US's attempt to gather information on nuclear weapons. They specifically wanted to focus on the shock the weapons generated, their blast radius, and preceding fallout. Operation Castle was a small part of a much bigger, secretive arms race between the US and the Soviet Union in the 1950s. In 1950, the US National Security Council released NSC 68, which was a 68-page secret paper that suggested quadrupling defense spending in the case the Soviets attacked. Adding to the secrecy, classified studies at the time projected that by 1958 the US wouldn't be able to retaliate against the Soviets in the case of an attack. Back to Castle Bravo though. It exploded at 15 megatons, which was, well, slightly higher than the scientists had originally projected. In fact, it was a whopping 2.5 times more intense than they had anticipated and can be attributed to some seriously complicated scientific miscalculations. Essentially what happened was that scientists at the time didn't realize that the solid source of fusion fuel we mentioned earlier, a lithium deuteride, would react the way it did in this extreme situation. And as it turns out, a tiny scientific mistake can have almost unfathomable results. An area of 7,000 miles surrounding Bikini Atoll was contaminated, most notably the atolls of Rongelap and Uttarik, and they felt the effects of radioactive poison almost immediately and for decades afterward. Radioactive material was spread to different parts all over the world too, later found in Japan, India, Australia, Europe, and the United States. Bravo's dangerous rain was mostly made up of pieces of coral, radioactive particles, and water. Alex Wellerstein, a scientist at the Stevens Institute of Technology, noted in a 2013 blog post that what most likely happened during Bravo was that small particles went up with the fireball and stayed aloft long enough to lose most of their radioactive energy and diffuse into the atmosphere, while heavy particles fell right back down again pretty quickly. So blowing up and irradiating something like coral is just the worst possible thing, he wrote. The people of Rongelap weren't evacuated until 3 days after the blast, an eternity to be exposed to so much dangerous radioactive material lingering in the air. They were exposed to radiation of 60 to 300 rem. Rem stands for 1 dose of radiation exposure.
5 to 10 of these alone are enough to change a person's blood chemistry. 400 units could wipe out half of an exposed population. To add to this, in studies as recently as 2010, the National Cancer Institute determined that almost 170 cancer cases among residents of the Marshall Islands who were alive between 1948 and 1970 could be attributed to exposure to radiation. Not all of the reasons why Castle Bravo went horribly wrong were due to scientific miscalculations, though, but in fact were caused by deception, negligence, and a combination of the two. The winds were much more intense than scientists previously thought before carrying out the test. They concluded that the winds were suitable 3 days before the bomb, but a really irresponsible duo, Major General Percy Clarkson, head of the military team that carried out the test, and the scientific director Dr. Alvin Graves, still went through with the plan even though the winds were recognized as unfavorable just 6 hours before the blast. The USS Curtis, a Navy ship, was 23 miles from the detonation. Writing for Medium, military historian Paul Richard helped us to picture what the day was like for the men on that ship, noting that the heat was like having a blowtorch applied to their bodies. Ouch. It's impossible to talk about Castle Bravo without mentioning Lucky Dragon No. 5, a Japanese tuna fishing boat with a 23-man crew that was about 80 miles away from Bikini Atoll when the test happened. According to a documentary for the Maryland History Day competition, the men on the boat witnessed the sun rise mysteriously in the west and heard a symphony of thunder and snow falling out of the sky. About an hour and a half after the initial explosion, one crew member died from the exposure and the others had adverse health effects as a result. One of these fishermen, Oishi Matasushi, remembered and described the Armageddon-like scene like this. A yellow flash poured through the porthole. Wondering what happened, I jumped up from the bunk near the door, ran out on the dock, and was astonished. Bridge, sky, and sea burst into view, painted in flaming sunset colors. I looked around in a daze. I was totally at a loss. Lucky Dragon also sparked international worry over the radioactive tuna that was aboard the boat when the bomb exploded. The Japanese called the whole event a second Hiroshima. They also almost severed ties with the US as a result. The US government doctor sent to Japan to help after the incident wrongly predicted that those on the boat would recover in a month. 6 months later, Aikichi Kuboyama, the Lucky Dragon's 40-year-old radio operator, succumbed to the damage caused by the radioactivity and died, leading to the New York Times naming him probably the world's first hydrogen bomb casualty. Lucky Dragon also had a profound effect on how the Castle Bravo narrative was framed. In a 2002 interview, physicist Ralph Lapp attributed Lucky Dragon as the singular event that made the US look bad, saying the story of the Lucky Dragon blew the lid off of secrecy because the Atomic Energy Commission could not keep it a secret. The story had to be told because radioactivity persisted and could deny territory to normal use. Furthermore, there was the fact that some of the chemicals in the fallout were highly toxic fission products, and this could be a health hazard. At this point, you might be wondering what happened to the people who were exposed to that fallout. Unfortunately, the reality of what happened was much more grim than anything that could be conjured up for a riveting science fiction movie. The US attempted to redeem themselves after the calamity, but they still managed to screw things up and cause even more long-term damage. Because the people of Rongelap were among those hit the hardest, they became the test subjects of a government-funded project called Project 4.1, more specifically named the study of response of human beings exposed to significant beta and gamma radiation due to the fallout from high-yield weapons, which took place a week after Bravo. The Rongelapese people weren't given a translator to break down what was going on, so they were essentially being tested on without proper consent. They were given medication without being told why they should take them. Pregnant women who were exposed to radiation eventually gave birth to deformed babies, some of which included larger than normal heads and opaque skin. None of these babies survived more than a few days after being born. Thyroid tumors, especially among the Rongelapese women, caused them to need corrective surgeries, which limited their abilities to speak and sing, a devastating side effect since singing is a revered part of Marshallese culture that goes back hundreds of years. Troy de Broom, who would later become the foreign minister to the Marshall Islands, was 9 years old during Bravo. From his perspective as just a kid, he remembered a flash of light, silent and brighter than the sun, and then watched the sky turn red as blood. That memory drove him in later years to make it his life's mission to fight for the injustices that happened to his people. To a crowd at the United Nations in 2005, he said, "United States government documents clearly demonstrate that its scientists conducted human radiation experiments with Marshallese citizens. Some of our people were injected with or were coerced to drink fluids laced with radiation. Other experiments involved the resettling of people on islands highly contaminated to study how human beings absorbed radiation from the food and environment. You could say Tony DeBrum was the Marshall Islands hero. He helped the islands become independent of the United States in 1979, and even helped file a lawsuit against the US for violating a treaty on nuclear non-proliferation. So Tony really wasn't messing around. You think the Castle Bravo disaster would be enough to stop nuclear bomb testing altogether, but Operation Castle continued on, with a total of 67 nuclear weapons tested in the Pacific Ocean. The other 5 parts of the operation were named Romeo, Coon, Union, Yankee, and Nectar. It finally came to a semblance of an end with the Limited Test Ban Treaty, which was signed and passed in 1963. It required that any and all tests be done underground, but it looks like there is some hope. Ever since 1992, the United States has relied on simulations of nuclear weapons instead of the real thing. The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, which would forbid any nuclear tests, garnered signatures from 184 countries in 1996. So while Castle Bravo led to a series of seemingly irreparable mistakes, there is a light at the end of the long tunnel that this won't ever happen again. On November 2, 2022, Belarusian separatist forces succeeded in driving President Alexander Lukashenko from Minsk. What follows is an intense and losing war for the fate of Belarus. Not willing to lose yet another former Soviet satellite to pro-Western forces, Russia launches its own invasion to put Lukashenko back in office. In response, the West pumps billions in weapons and military assistance to the separatist forces, who fight the Russian military to a standstill. Out of frustration and with increasing threats to his legitimacy, Russian President Vladimir Putin authorizes the use of a tactical nuclear weapon against separatist forces. For the United States, this is a thin red line in the sand, and they respond in kind with their own nuclear strike against the Russian forces inside Belarus itself. Russia won't take this lying down and chooses to escalate up the nuclear ladder. From a silo in Siberia, a single ICBM lifts off and rockets into space, but it doesn't come down over an American city. Instead, it strikes a U.S. carrier battle group just offshore near Japan. The nuclear detonation is visible to the Japanese citizens along the beaches, a few dozen miles from the carrier battle group's current location. Thousands of American sailors die in seconds. Thousands more will die from radiation poisoning or from drowning as their battered ships sink. The United States of America immediately responds with a nuclear strike against the Russian naval facility in Tartus, off the Syrian coast. A blossoming fireball signals the annihilation of thousands of Russian sailors and over a dozen ships. Vladimir Putin then takes the unimaginable escalatory step up the nuclear ladder. He calls for an attack on the U.S. naval port of Pearl Harbor, the most important Navy base the U.S. operates. Dozens of ships are destroyed or severely damaged, and tens of thousands die, both military personnel and civilians. This attack has taken place on American soil and prompts an immediate and full nuclear retaliation. But as American missiles are lifting off from silos across the American Midwest, Russian missiles likewise roar into the sky. Submarines prowling the world's oceans on both sides of the conflict surface to firing depth and unleash their own deadly salvos of nuclear intercontinental ballistic missiles. The world has approximately 30 minutes left to enjoy the prosperity of the 21st century before it's thrown screaming back into the 1st century AD in a global nuclear exchange that will leave even those untouched by the bombs struggling to survive. This is mad inaction, or mutually assured destruction, and it's the reason why in the almost 8 decades since the invention of the atomic bomb, the world hasn't yet been subjected to total nuclear warfare. Currently, there are only 9 nuclear states, and the world is working hard to keep that number from growing. These states are China, France, India, Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States. However, there are fears that Iran might soon join the ranks, which would kick off a new nuclear arms race in the Middle East, and the potential expansion of nuclear status to countries such as Jordan and Saudi Arabia. At the height of the Cold War, the United States had a frankly absurd 31,225 nuclear weapons, while the Soviet Union at the time of collapse in 1991 had an estimated 35,000. A large number of these weapons were of the tactical variety, meaning weapons below 10 kilotons and primarily designed to be used against military targets. The development of tactical nuclear weapons kicked off in the 60s, with the introduction of everything from nuclear landmines to nuclear air defense missiles and even portable nuclear weapons that airborne troops could take with them behind enemy lines. Tactical nuclear weapons were originally meant to avoid escalation up the nuclear ladder that would lead to complete destruction, but ironically their introduction led to a brand new arms race and the development of thousands of tactical weapons. The reason for this mini arms race was simple. If one side had more tactical nuclear weapons than the other, they would be in a position where they might feel they could win an exchange. Thus, to discourage this bad thinking, numbers parity had to be achieved. It was basically a repeat of the original atomic arms race. Today, Russia claims to have around 6,257 nuclear warheads, while the US has around 5,550. Traditional tactical weapons have been largely replaced with variable yield warheads, which can be used in both tactical engagements by lowering the yield or in city-busting all-out destruction by increasing their yield. There is still, however, a number of purely tactical weapons, and a new fear thanks to the end of the intermediate missile ban is that a fresh arms race for a tactical nuclear weapon is about to begin or has already started. Today, the other 8 nuclear powers are France with 290 weapons, China with 350, the United Kingdom with 180 active weapons and 45 retired weapons that can be reactivated if the need arises, Israel with 90 weapons, Pakistan with 165 weapons, India with 160, and North Korea with an estimated 20 weapons. All in all, over 12,000 nuclear weapons are either on active status or retired but still capable of being reactivated in case of a war. Of gravest concern, though, is the 900 weapons that the United States and Russia each have, which they maintain on ready alert, meaning they could be launched within 15 minutes of the order being given. The rest of the world's nuclear stockpile is largely kept in reserve and would need to be physically mated with their launch delivery systems before being employed, a process that could take days or even weeks. The United Kingdom and France both maintain weapons in detargeted mode on their ballistic missile submarines and would need hours or days to make ready for use. The US's most powerful nuke is the B-83, which can be dialed up to a yield of 1.2 megatons. This is 60 times more powerful than the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. It has a blast radius of just over 20 miles, which would devastate any major city it was dropped on. But these weapons often don't come alone. They're packed together with other bombs inside a multiple impact reentry vehicle or MIRV warhead. To destroy a sprawling metropolitan city like Paris, 3 of these warheads could be targeted at different points in the city, and there would still be more munitions to drop elsewhere from the same missile. But thanks to mutually assured destruction, MAD for short, this has yet to happen and is very unlikely to. But what is it exactly and how does it work? MAD is a simple concept. Any schoolyard child involved in a water balloon fight understands. You have water balloons, but so do I. If you throw one of your balloons at me, I will drench you by throwing all of mine. So it's better to find a victim instead who has no water balloons to throw back at you. 2 nuclear powers are unlikely to use the nuclear weapons against each other because both know that they will suffer an immediate and overwhelming response. This leaves the only acceptable option as a full-scale nuclear war, which itself is completely unacceptable to anyone but a complete psychopath. Thus, nuclear war is averted. But mutually assured destruction doesn't work without some key capabilities. First, both sides must have an arsenal large enough to threaten near or complete annihilation of any potential nuclear foe. If a country has only a limited arsenal, the MAD doctrine begins to break down because suddenly nuclear war becomes winnable. For example, Israel, with only 90 nuclear weapons, could never enforce the doctrine of MAD against a country like Russia. The great disparity in numbers and the size of Russia means that in the nuclear calculus, a nuclear war between Russia and Israel is extremely winnable, especially when you factor in the fact that a percentage of these weapons will be intercepted, malfunction, or destroyed before they can be employed. Secondly, for MAD to work, both countries must have capable and credible delivery methods for their nuclear weapons. Just after the Second World War, the United States enjoyed a brief period of absolute nuclear domination over the Soviet Union due to the fact that the Soviets didn't have any bombers capable of making the long trip to the US to deliver their nuclear cargo. The US, however, did, and this meant that in the case of a war, the Soviet Union was at the absolute mercy of the US and its nuclear arsenal. The advent of long-range bombers, reverse-engineered from a captured American bomber in World War II, suddenly leveled the playing field and prompted a massive bomber arms race between the two countries. However, with the leaps in long-range missile technology, the bomber was no longer the premier deterrent weapon, and nuclear parity was once more achieved. The final principle that makes mutually assured destruction work is maintaining a survivable deterrent force. Many nuclear weapons kept on ready status are equipped onto long-range ICBMs, themselves inside silos across vast missile fields in both the US and Russia. These fields, however, are vulnerable to nuclear attack, and in fact would be the very first target of any nuclear attack between the two nations. Thus, the concept of the nuclear triad was born, with the purpose of ensuring that nuclear deterrence was credible and survivable by adopting 3 means of launching or responding to a nuclear attack. The first leg of the nuclear triad is ground-based missiles. ICBMs changed the nuclear game forever by allowing one nation to hit any other nation on Earth with a nuclear weapon no matter the location. Even better, they were impossible to defend against, since they were fired from deep inside friendly territory and traveled to their targets in a half hour or less. Plus, as they descend through the atmosphere, radar tracking becomes difficult, and actually intercepting a warhead moving at thousands of miles an hour becomes nearly impossible. Recent advances in missile defenses have made radar tracking of incoming warheads more reliable, and better computing now makes interception of a warhead with a kinetic kill vehicle possible. This basically involves shooting another missile at an incoming missile and has been described as shooting a bullet with a bullet. However, missiles have now evolved to include countermeasures that makes interception difficult. This includes things such as massive clouds of chaff that are expelled from the warhead delivery vehicle during its suborbital flight. The highly reflective chaff confuses incoming radar and makes picking out an actual warhead from the noise difficult. However, improvements in computer processing power have made chaff less effective than it once was. Another countermeasure involves the use of dummy warheads packaged together with live ones. Rather than avoid interception, this tactic hopes to eat up interceptors by luring them into attacking fake warheads and allowing the real ones to slip right through. The best countermeasure, however, is directly attacking your enemy's detection assets, either electronically or with kinetic attacks. By blinding your opponent, you make it impossible for them to intercept your incoming attacks. ICBMs still remain the main tool of nuclear deterrence, but increasingly sophisticated ballistic missile defense technologies and the vulnerability of missile fields themselves to attack means that other components are necessary to ensure survivability in case of an attack. Nations like Russia often maintain a mobile ICBM fleet mounted on trucks, which can be difficult or impossible to track and target. But no ground-based deterrent is complete without the other two legs of the nuclear triad. To supplement ground-based missiles, bomber forces make up the second leg of the nuclear triad. This consists of weapons dropped from long-range bombers close to enemy targets. In the past, this would have been carried out in large-scale attacks, involving hundreds of bombers all carrying gravity or dumb bombs. To ensure redundancy, as much as a dozen bombers might be tasked with destroying the same target, with the expectation that many of them would be destroyed by enemy air defenses while en route. If multiple aircraft succeeded in reaching a target, bomber crews had a laundry list of additional targets to hit after in order of priority, as they also carried multiple bombs. A single B-52 bomber might service as much as half a dozen targets before being destroyed itself. Modern air defenses have greatly reduced the effectiveness of the nuclear bomber, though, but not nullified it. Instead of a dumb gravity bomb that had to be dropped over or near the target, bombers now carry long-range standoff attack munitions, which allow them to simply approach enemy territory and fire salvos of nuclear cruise missiles from out of the range of enemy air defense. Some very forward-deployed fighters might pick off a few bombers, but the long range means that most will at least get to their launch point successfully. These missiles, however, must themselves evade ever more sophisticated air defenses, since most modern air defenses are also capable of targeting incoming missiles. To do this, they're fired in large volleys, or take circuitous flight routes that avoid known air defense sites, while also flying low to the ground to avoid enemy radar. Stealth materials aid missiles by reducing their radar signatures, which allow them to get closer to their targets before being detected, and thus shortens the window for a successful interception. The American B-2 and soon the B-21 Raider, however, use the most advanced stealth technology in the world to penetrate deep into enemy airspace, which allows them to carry out lethally precise strikes using conventional or nuclear weapons. While the effectiveness of stealth will invariably wane over the coming decades due to advances in radar and computer processing, America's stealth bombers and the use of long-range standoff attack munitions means that the bomber leg of the nuclear triad remains alive and well. The advantage that bombers will always enjoy over ground-based ICBMs, however, is their ability to be mobile. For much of the Cold War, the U.S. maintained a fleet of nuclear-armed bombers on constant alert and on patrol routes near the Soviet border. In a new escalation of tensions, nuclear bombers would resume these deterrence patrols, which place them near enemy borders, and greatly reduces the time allowed for interception before they strike their targets. This makes them much more survivable than ground-based ICBMs, which are extremely vulnerable to an overwhelming first strike. The final leg of the nuclear triad is one that specifically was created to avoid nuclear defeat via an overwhelming first strike, and ensure mutually assured destruction in any case. Toward the end of World War II, the Germans developed a submarine-launched version of the V-2 ballistic missile. The missile would be placed inside a launch tube that was then towed behind the submarine and would allow the Germans to get much closer to Britain before firing it, increasing its precision and lessening the chance of interception. However, the war ended before it could be tested. The concept of a submarine-launched nuclear missile was not lost on both Russian and American engineers as the Cold War dawned. Unlike aircraft or even ground-based missiles, submarine-launched missiles would basically be impossible to defend against or neutralize, as an enemy submarine could be lurking right off your own coast at any time. This would give its missile a flight path of mere minutes. It could even make the concept of a winnable nuclear war possible, as a large enough fleet could launch an attack that would completely neutralize an enemy's arsenal before it got a chance to fully mobilize its own response. The Soviets would beat the Americans to the punch, as they often did in the field of rocketry, by launching the first submarine-launched ballistic missile in 1955. They promptly equipped a small fleet of submarines with 2 nuclear missiles each, creating the first nuclear-capable submarine fleet. However, the United States launched its own ballistic missile submarine in 1959, and unlike the Soviet submarines, the American boat was nuclear-powered. This meant that it was much harder to detect, as it could remain submerged indefinitely, only being limited by the food required for the crew. It also outgunned any Soviet submarine with 16 missiles versus the 2 each Soviet Zulu-class submarine had. Eventually, both the Soviet Union and the US would create a sizable nuclear ballistic missile submarine fleet, threatening each other with undetectable nuclear annihilation, and thus maintaining the balance. In essence, while submarines were stealthy assassins that could make nuclear war winnable, now both sides had a knife to the other's throat, and peace was achieved. On a side note, the Soviets were always behind the Americans in the submarine design, and knew their boats were very detectable to American attack submarines and other ASW weapons. Thus, they opted to build a fleet of road-mobile ICBM launchers to make their land-based deterrent even more resilient. The United States, with the superior submarines, never felt the need to follow suit, knowing that their submarines were far more likely to survive than Soviet submarines were. The nuclear triad ensures nuclear deterrence by maintaining a credible and survivable nuclear force. An enemy is thus disallowed the idea of achieving a winnable exchange by the sheer fact that the 3 elements of the nuclear triad are incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to simultaneously neutralize. Under a fully operational nuclear triad, an enemy's surprise first strike might eliminate large amounts of the nuclear force, but enough would remain that an overwhelming counterattack is guaranteed. Like 2 gunfighters holding a pistol to each other's head, the nuclear triad ensures mutually assured destruction and is the reason that the world has never seen a nuclear war. But let's say a nuclear war did take place. What would that look like? A nuclear war would indubitably begin with a first strike by one of the 2 combatants in a bolt-out-of-the-blue attack. Unlike conventional forces, nuclear weapons require very little time to mobilize and prepare for use, and in fact can be fully prepared for launch with little if any signs to the enemy that an attack was incoming. American ICBMs, for example, are fully prepared for launch in their silos and have target coordinates dialed in. There is no off switch. The entire launch system cannot be shut down except in the case of complete loss of power. Even then, backup generators allow the silo facility to operate long enough to successfully launch its weapon. Thus, a nuclear war would begin with a first strike against enemy missile fields, likely by submarine-launched attacks. Enemy subs would quietly penetrate the coastal waters of an enemy nation and get close enough that their weapon's flight time to the target is too low for a successful interception. Though some point defense anti-ballistic missile defenses could still successfully intercept during the terminal descent stage. By the time that the first salvo of submarine-based weapons was fired, though, ground-based weapons would also be lifting up from their silos. Thus, the nation caught by surprise would be facing nuclear impacts within minutes from submarine weapons, and follow-on impacts within a half hour at the most from ground-based missiles. The initial strikes from submarine nukes would wipe out missile fields before authorization to fire could be successfully given, relayed, and carried out, while detection would be nearly instant thanks to very robust surveillance capabilities by both Russia and the US. It would still take time to relay the news to the respective leader, who would then have to authorize the release of the weapons, and exactly how many. By the time orders are relayed to silos, they would almost certainly be destroyed. Submarine attacks would also likely target major air bases known for nuclear operations. Destroying nuclear stockpiles is not necessary, as all an attack would have to do is render the air facilities themselves inoperable. Big nuclear bombers need equally large airfields to fly from, and there's no hope that a nuclear bomber could be fueled, armed, and take off before even a ground-based missile wiped out its airbase. The only way nuclear air forces remain survivable in a surprise attack is if they already have a number of bombers on alert and ready to take off. This was exactly the case for the majority of the Cold War, with pilots and crews spending their shifts inside ready rooms and their armed bombers fueled and loaded right outside the door. In less than 10 minutes, a nuclear-armed B-52 would be taxiing off to bring nuclear devastation somewhere inside the Soviet Union. With ground-based weapons largely destroyed and airfields hosting nuclear bombers rendered inoperable, an alert goes out to the 3rd surviving leg of the nuclear triad, the ballistic missile submarine fleet. Stationed in remote corners all over the world, Finding one of these SSBNs is like hunting for a needle in a haystack, and the massive range of their weapons means that they don't need to be anywhere near their targets to strike at them. These submarine fleets alone carry enough power to completely decimate even a large nation like the US or Russia, leveling every single major population center in either country. Unknown to the Soviets during the Cold War, the US was very successful in tracking Soviet submarines thanks to a vast underwater detection system known as SOSUS. The Soviet Union might have been ahead of the US during much of the Cold War in terms of rocketry, but the United States was the king of the ocean, with both ballistic missile and attack submarines far more capable and quieter than their Soviet counterparts. In fact, for decades, Soviet submarines would often have an American tail on them from the moment they left harbor, and if nuclear war ever broke out, the bulk of the Soviet submarine fleet would have been destroyed before getting a chance to launch their weapons. Advances in Soviet submarine technology and the discovery of SOSUS's capabilities by the Soviets eventually eroded this advantage and once more restored parity and balance to the doctrine of mutually assured destruction that kept both nations at peace with one another. Nuclear bombs, the most powerful and closely guarded weapons ever created. Here are 15 of the strangest things that you never knew about the nuclear bomb. Number 15. A costly miss. You remember as a kid, when you had the perfect water balloon to sock your brother in the face on a hot summer day, you carefully took aim and whiffed. The balloon popped on the ground, he got splashed at most, and then the next thing you knew you're getting wailed on. Well, at least you didn't miss on something much bigger like the team at Bikini Atoll did. It was not long after the first two bombs were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the US team wanted to learn more about the bomb's capabilities without nuking another city. So they chose a small island chain to test out their new toy. Part of the Marshall Islands chain, Bikini Atoll was under US control and close enough to a military base. With only 167 people that would need to be relocated whether they agreed or not, it was deemed an ideal location for a nuclear test. It was February 1946 when the island was evacuated, and in July 1946 the first payload was delivered. It was designed to be dropped from a bomber near a collection of ships loaded with lab animals so that scientists could study the long-term effects of radiation. The ships were in place, and then somehow everything went wrong. A B-29 bomber did drop its payload, but somehow it dropped it almost 2,000 feet from the target. It was close enough that it sank several of the ships and killed more than a third of the lab animals from residual radiation. But it was far from a full-on test that they wanted. What went wrong exactly? No one knows. But the next time you screw up at work, at least you can say you aren't the guy that misfired an atom bomb. And the military wasn't done with Bikini Atoll just yet. Number 14. Rough beach weather. So the military missed their first test at Bikini Atoll. It happens. They shrugged that off and they bounced back with a second test only a few weeks later. While the first bomb was dropped and exploded above ground, this one would be timed to explode underwater to test the effect of the radiation and blast on the water. They knew the results would be unpredictable, and that's exactly what they got. This first underwater test of a nuclear weapon didn't just prove how powerful the bombs were, it proved that their power was highly unpredictable, and it might have led to more caution in the future. Test Baker was launched on July 25, 1946, and the bomb was successfully dropped and exploded 90 feet under the water. And that's when things started to get crazy. The interaction of the bomb with the water created a massive bubble of hot gas under the water that quickly expanded, both downward and upward at the same time. Nothing in its path was any match for it, and that included the shores of Bikini Atoll. It would take a while for the full effects of the bomb to be known, but some were clear right away. Those who were nearby reported the energy from the bomb created a massive geyser-like plume of water that soon turned into a mile-high dome. This whipped up a tsunami with a wave topping 94 feet, long enough to lift a 27,000-ton ship into the air. When the chaos cleared, the military was able to observe a massive crater 2,000 feet wide carved into the sea floor, and many of the ships that were nearby were covered in radioactive energy. That is, except for the 8 that were sunk. They're keeping their secrets at the bottom of the ocean. But for some people, the effects of these tests lasted long after they were done. Number 13. The longest vacation. When the residents of Bikini Atoll were told they had to evacuate, they were told it would be a temporary evacuation for the tests. It was needed for the security of the country, and they were assured that they'd be back home soon. They were taken to temporary housing and assured that they would be returned when it was safe. So they waited, and then they waited some more. Eventually, they were moved from their barracks to another island in the Marshall Islands, and the promise of home seemed to be more remote than ever. But then, in the late 1960s, there seemed to be hope. the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission declared the island safe for return, and some residents went back to their homes for the first time in 20 years. The government kept close tabs on their health, and then in the late 70s they discovered something disturbing. Everyone who had returned and eaten the food on the island had alarmingly high rates of cesium-137 in their blood. The radioactive energy might have hidden well, but it was definitely still present on Bikini Atoll. And so history soon repeated itself. The residents of the island were once again evacuated, this time to more remote Kili Island, as scientists began to investigate the residual impact of the bombs on Bikini Atoll more thoroughly. Their conclusion? It wasn't safe for the residents to return, and it might never be. Anyone living consistently on an island where nuclear tests had been conducted would be subject to potentially dangerous levels of radiation, and the island would need a more thorough cleaning if anyone was to return. But that might not happen, as the island now is classified as a UNESCO World Heritage Site and a key cautionary tale. But today people are more worried about who has them, not how they're tested. Number 12. All around the world. So, who's a member of the nuclear club? That depends on who you ask. During World War II, it was believed that the United States and Germany were in a rush to beat each other to the bomb and use it, but that's now considered to be false, as it was discovered to mainly be a one-man race. The US got the bomb first, Germany wasn't really close, and the rest was history. But once the US got the bomb, the other powers quickly followed suit. The USSR was the second to get the bomb, only 4 years later, and they were followed by the United Kingdom in 1952, France in 1960, and China in 1964. And the world powers said that's enough. With 2 Soviet-aligned powers with nukes and 3 Western powers having them, both sides were worried about things spiraling out of control, especially after several close calls with World War III. So they passed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which took effect in 1970. All 5 existing nuclear powers were grandfathered in, but no new nuclear powers were allowed, and it lasted for a while. That is, until India and Pakistan, neither of which had signed the treaty, developed their own nuclear programs. The neighbors are often in conflict, and that's made the neighborhood a lot more tense. But it's not the only flashpoint. Under the always chaotic Kim dynasty, the Hermit Kingdom of North Korea rarely abided by treaties, so it was alarming, if not surprising, when they conducted their first nuclear test in 2006. They're now believed to have up to 20 warheads, which has made stopping many of their aggressive activities much trickier. But that's nowhere near as complicated as what's going on with the signatory Israel, which has never revealed any details about its nuclear arsenal. Insiders say the country might have at least 90 nuclear weapons, but what makes enforcing the NPT trickier is that they might have had them since the 1960s, which would mean that they'd have been covered under the initial treaty's exceptions. At least they would be if they admitted to having a nuclear arsenal. But who has the biggest, missiles? Number 11. The big guns. So who has the most powerful nuclear arsenal in the world? That's hard to gauge, because it depends on both the number of nuclear weapons and how they can be delivered, as well as their condition. North Korea has the smallest number of weapons and only land and sea-based delivery systems, which means it'd be easier to target their batteries and stop the missiles from taking off, although they're developing faster and faster weapons as we speak. Pakistan and India, which have around 160 bombs each, also lack an air-based delivery system, likely because their systems are designed for close quarters delivery to their neighbor. But what about the superpowers? The United Kingdom has 225 nuclear weapons, but only a sea-based delivery system. As an island nation, their surrounding waters are key to their national defense. But it's also been a very long time since they've had to worry about using them. France's sea and air-based systems are suitable for their 290 weapons, but barring a full-on war with Russia, they're not expecting any attacks on their soil anytime soon. Israel isn't talking as usual, but they're believed to have a 3-pronged nuclear triad. What they might lack, though, is long-range missiles, as they're more concerned with their neighbors attacking again. And so we come to the big guns. China is believed to have only 350 nuclear missiles, but all of them are attached to high-level delivery systems that might be able to hit anywhere on the planet. That makes them a formidable threat that might not be able to win a third world war, but certainly could scare others off from fighting it. However, they have only a tenth of the arsenal of the United States and Russia, with 5,400 and just under 6,000 missiles respectively. This comes from their constant standoff during the Cold War, with both having a powerful nuclear triad able to reach across the world in minutes. So does Russia's numbers edge give it a win? Probably not. While they have more bombs, most are believed to be in poor condition, so their actual usable arsenal might be only half that number. And today's nuclear bombs are a lot more powerful than they used to be. Number 10. Kaboom! The bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were powerful enough to devastate both cities and kill nearly 200,000 people, and yet soon enough they looked like little firecrackers compared to what was coming. The original nuclear bombs were soon replaced with far more powerful and unpredictable hydrogen bombs. In 1954, when the US military returned to Bikini Atoll for another test, this time they would be conducting the Bravo test of a 23,500-pound hydrogen bomb, and it did not disappoint. They were expecting a 5-megaton blast. Instead, they were taken aback when the islands were hit with a 15-megaton blast. It ripped through the atoll, destroying 3 nearby islands, and ripped a mile-wide crater in the central lagoon. A scientist later estimated that the amount of debris hurled in the air was equivalent to over 200 skyscrapers. But the damage didn't stay where it was supposed to. 80 miles away, a Japanese fishing vessel was reeling in the day's catch when they were bombarded by radioactive debris from the explosion. Several other populated atolls were hit by radiation as well, and soon one crew member of the boat died of a mysterious illness. Was it radiation sickness, as Japanese scientists concluded? It's not clear, but one thing was, nuclear scientists knew they needed to get better at estimating the sizes of the blasts created by these weapons before they deployed them, especially if they intended to use the bombs in combat. But it wasn't the largest nuclear bomb ever tested. Number 9. Drop the bomb. That honor went to the Soviets in 1961. It had the impressive name of Tsar Bomba, or King Bomb, and it lived up to the hype. It had a yield of over 50 megatons, which made it over 3,000 more times powerful than the ones that hit Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The yield was equivalent to 50 million tons of TNT, which would be more than enough to atomize any major city around the world. So, how do we know about this bomb? The Soviets were notoriously secretive about the nuclear program, just like any nation is, but if you knew where to look, it was impossible to avoid finding out about it. The Tsar Bomba was dropped on October 30th, 1961, on Novaya Zemlya, an archipelago in the northern part of Russia. For such a valuable asset, it was dropped using a surprisingly low-tech method. They strapped it to a parachute and pushed it out of a plane before detonating it around 13,000 feet above the ground, and it was a roaring success. The United States had picked up information about the detonation from sources and sent a U.S. reconnaissance aircraft to spy on the detonation. They got a close-up view, but the heat from the bomb was so intense that it burned the outside of the aircraft and the plane. The only reason the plane didn't go down was because of its anti-radiation paint that barely held up. While the explosion was massive, it's actually considered one of the cleanest nuclear bombs ever detonated, with 97% of its yield coming from a thermonuclear fusion reaction. It burned hard and fast with minimal fallout. But would you believe that nuclear bombs can also be gifts? Number 8. Do not open. Only 9 countries are believed to have developed their own nuclear weapons programs, but that doesn't mean they're the only ones that have them on their soil. The United States is part of NATO and has committed to the collective defense of all of Europe against any threat. To that end, they've lent out some of their nuclear weapons to be deployed in countries including Germany, Italy, Turkey, the Netherlands, and Belgium. But these weapons can't be launched by the host country, they're still under US control, and can only be deployed by the US in an event of an invasion against NATO. But the US wasn't the only country who did this. The United States could lend out its nukes as a deterrent, but so could the Soviet Union. In fact, that might have led to the world's closest brush with nuclear war when the Soviets decided to deploy nuclear missiles into newly communist Cuba in the 1960s, only miles from Florida's shore. The standoff nearly led to a hot war, and the Soviet Union did ultimately back down. Today, while no countries are actually giving away their nuclear weapons, many people are concerned that China and Pakistan might aid Iran as the country tries to become the 10th member of the nuclear club. But did you know that the US nearly nuked itself? Number 7. Whoops. When transporting nuclear bombs, it stands to reason that you should be pretty careful. But that doesn't mean things can't go wrong. Very wrong. That's what happened near Goldsboro, North Carolina in 1961. A Boeing B-52 Stratofortress was flying overhead when it suddenly sprung a nasty fuel leak. It tried to maintain a holding pattern until it could be fixed, but it lost too much fuel and was about to crash. It was ordered to head back to base and land because it was carrying precious cargo that couldn't be lost, namely 2 nuclear bombs. But as it made its descent, things went south in a hurry. Literally, the pilots lost control and had no choice but to abandon the aircraft. Only 5 of the men survived, with 2 dying in the crash and 1 being fatally injured in a failed parachute landing. But the plane carrying its deadly cargo made a crash landing near Goldsboro, spreading debris over a 2-square-mile area of farmland. And everyone in the know wondered, was the US about to accidentally nuke itself? Surprisingly, the answer was no. Nuclear bombs are hardy for good reason, and neither bomb detonated upon impact. The bombs were recovered, with one of them found hanging on a tree by its parachute. The other bomb was found in a muddy field, and when it was discovered that it was partially armed but stable, it was decided to leave it there. They removed the explosive part but left the plutonium core at the base of a now secure location. It wasn't until years later that it was revealed that the other hanging bomb had gone 3/4 of the way to fully arming itself in the fall, which means we nearly lost North Carolina. But it wasn't the only hair-raising nuclear bomb incident for the US. Number 6. Pay up. Things can go wrong when you have multiple large aircraft flying through the air, even more so if some are carrying nuclear weapons. In 1966, a B-52G bomber was refueling mid-air over the Mediterranean Sea when a collision occurred. The refueling aircraft crashed when its fuel tank ignited, killing everyone on board, while the bomber went down and lost 3 of its 7 crew members, as well as its cargo of 4 hydrogen bombs. Had they all sunk to the bottom of the Mediterranean? The government found 3 of them in a small Spanish village where they had contaminated a 2-kilometer area with radiation, but didn't fully detonate. But what about the 4th? Well, that's one of the strangest stories in Cold War history. The 4th bomb seemed to have disappeared into thin air, and an exhaustive search by the military turned up nothing. But then they received a tip from a local fisherman named Francisco Simo Orts, who claimed to have seen the bomb hit the water. The military wanted to hire him, but he knew his worth and later demanded a payment of $20 million. The bomb was supposedly worth $1 billion, and maritime law says he's entitled to 1% of that. The Air Force did ultimately make him an offer, and the bomb was safely recovered. It's not clear if Simo Orts ever did receive his payment. The US seems to lose nuclear bombs in all sorts of places, but this has to top them all. Number 5. The air up there. If a nuclear bomb got detonated in space, you'd probably either assume it was a horrible mishap or a space war just started. But in 1962, the US actually detonated a thermonuclear warhead in the sky on purpose. The test was titled Starfish Prime, and it was one of the only nuclear tests ever conducted in outer space at a whopping altitude of 250 miles. A Thor missile was launched into the sky and then remotely detonated from a safe distance, and the world would see exactly how powerful those weapons were. It worked brilliantly. Maybe a little too well. The bomb created a massive fireball in the sky, as the nuclear debris created a massive aurora that could be seen from hundreds of miles away. In Honolulu, Hawaii, the aurora burst through the thin clouds and created a massive flash of light. Radioactive debris fell on nearby Johnson Atoll. 3 satellites in low Earth orbit were disabled by the radioactive waves, and man-made radiation belts were formed that wreaked havoc with satellites for months to come. The government wanted to know what detonating a nuke in space would do, and the answer was quite a lot. In fact, nuclear bombs might be so powerful that they created their own element. Number 4. What is trinitite? The Trinity nuclear test in New Mexico in July 1945 was one of the most important moments in human history, paving the way for the dropping of the first 2 bombs and Japan's unconditional surrender not long after. The test was a massive success and proof of concept for the entire weapons program, and it left a lot of destruction in its wake. After scientists were able to explore the area safely, they found something weird: pieces of glassy residue that were unlike anything found in nature, mixed into the sand on the desert floor. What did the bomb create? Pieces of the strange new substance kept being found around the desert, mostly a light green color, but some in odd colors like red and black. They were given the nickname trinitite after the test that created them, but it wasn't a whole new element or anything unusual. They were the product of what happens when sand and other minerals meet the intense heat of a nuclear blast. They were fused together in a dense glass-like structure, and there are countless pieces of it now on display. But this wasn't the only nuclear test with a mixed legacy. Number 3. Anyone up for a swim? Lake Shagan, a lovely place to swim in Kazakhstan with a strange history, because this isn't a natural lake. In 1965, when Kazakhstan was part of the Soviet Union, the Russians decided to conduct a nuclear test in the Shagan River. They placed a 140-kiloton device in a hole they dug in the river, almost 600 feet deep, and then detonated it, creating a massive crater. When the dust settled, the crater started to fill up with water, creating a new artificial lake, with the rim of the crater holding the water in place. So what is this lake like today, over 55 years later? Surprisingly, it is not a nuclear wasteland at all. The radiation levels in the lake have decreased to the point where exposure isn't really a risk, and locals regularly swim in it. The authorities in the now independent country warned that they can't guarantee anyone's safety, but that hasn't stopped daring locals from fishing in it and eating their potentially radioactive catch. No word on anyone fishing out any 3-eyed fish just yet, and so far there are no reports of ill effects, which led to New Zealand documentarian David Ferrier to visit the lake for lunch with a local fisherman for his Netflix series Dark Tourist. And nuclear tests even provide a way to solve crime. Number 2. Time and time again. The world of art forgery is one of the most complicated to crack. There are highly skilled craftsmen who can duplicate some of the most famous artworks in the world, stealing the original and selling it on the black market while leaving a modern clone in its wake. Testing for art forgeries is difficult as well, since dating the painting can be difficult and risks damaging it. But recently, scientists have developed a way to test with maximum reliability without damaging the painting. There is one clear giveaway that a painting is newer than 1945, and it all started with Trinity. Finding a painting's exact date is often impossible, but what if someone is claiming a painting was made by an artist from the 1800s? You test it, and it tests positive for trace amounts of cesium-137 and strontium-90. On go the cuffs, and the art forger is sent away to the big house. That's because these isotopes were only created by nuclear weapons, and if a painting tests positive for them, then they have to have been created after 1945. But there's one nuclear mystery that is stranger than any other. Number 1. The Vela Incident. The year was 1979, and somewhere between Antarctica and the southern tip of Africa, something unusual was going on. Near the South African territory of Prince Edward Islands, there's an unidentified flash of light, followed by another. It's detected by 2 American Vela satellites, which were designed to detect nuclear explosion in violation of the ban on nuclear tests. This matched all the signs of an unauthorized test, but there was one problem. No one knew who conducted it, and we still don't. Both India and Pakistan were testing nuclear bombs at the time, but neither one was considered a likely suspect. France also had a territory nearby in the Kerguelen Islands and could have been testing a small neutron bomb. No one knew exactly where Israel was testing its top-secret nuclear weapons, since their small territory left them very little room to play with. And the most common theory is that it might have just been a joint Israel-South African nuclear test. But even today, there is no proof of who was behind this mysterious explosion, and nuclear historians would love some answers, but no one's talking. A searing white-hot flash of light burst over the horizon, followed by a deafening roar of a colossal explosion, drowning out the wail of warning sirens. Many had been instantly blinded by looking directly at the light. Others were incinerated on the spot from being too close to the blast. Then there were those lucky enough to avoid both, but who still got caught in the shockwaves, traveling at supersonic speeds, destroying anything in its path. Anyone at a safe enough distance saw the skyline was now dominated by a dark, looming shape of a mushroom cloud, and the sight filled them with inescapable dread at what was coming next. It had finally happened. The first bomb had been dropped, and more were on the way. A bombardment of radioactive hellfire raining down across the world. Nuclear war had broken out, a war without any hope for survival. Yet, there was but one left. The Black Hills mountain range in South Dakota had once been home to a former army base that was snapped up by a real estate company called Vivos. But they hadn't been apartments or condominiums. Their dealings were in state-of-the-art, catastrophe-ready doomsday bunkers so people could survive the end of days at affordable prices. Mason had never been a doomsday prepper, one of those people who seemed a little too excited about the prospect of the world ending, stockpiling as many guns and cans of soup as they could cram into their homemade several $1,000 panic rooms. But even though he wasn't crazy, Mason had always said there was never too high a price to pay for peace of mind, even if 55 grand wasn't exactly cheap. You see, Mason might not have considered himself to be paranoid, but he was certainly aware. He paid attention to the world around him, noticed the mounting international tensions and worrying signs on the news. And so when he heard that a company was selling nuclear bunkers, it seemed to be a worthwhile investment. After all, if the world didn't end, he could always refurbish it into an escape room or a novelty Airbnb. Little did he expect he actually would get to use it. Whereas most contingency plans for nuclear Armageddon were focused on ensuring the survival of the wealthy and powerful, Mason had fallen into a very small niche of people who were aware the world was edging closer to destruction and who could also afford to be prepared for the outcome. Sure enough, when the nukes started to fly left, right, and center, that preparation had paid off. It wasn't clear who had fired the first shot, but what was clear, at least to those paying attention like Mason, was that the bombs had hit other states first. Being at a distance from a raging fireball caused by an atomic explosion and far out of the range of the electromagnetic pulse frying power grids and electronic devices brought him a few precious moments of escape time. But it wouldn't be long before the nuclear barrage hit South Dakota as well. Racing as fast as his car could take him, Mason sped from his home in nearby Hill City to the mountains, not stopping until he was securely locked inside his bunker. Breathing a sigh of relief, he was grateful to have made it to safety. And from the sounds of the carnage unfolding above, he'd made it not a moment too soon. Underground, he was protected from the shockwaves, extreme heat and radiation released by any nuclear bomb that dropped. But of course, it was hard to be happy about the whole situation. Hearing the world ending right above your head will certainly make any sense of relief very fleeting. Once the existential dread of knowing everything he knew and loved was being reduced to ash, and wondering if he was the last man on Earth, had eventually subsided, Mason was left with an equally horrifying question. What now? Fortunately, Mason's bunker wasn't just an empty, unfurnished underground room. It had been outfitted for at least a year's worth of minimal autonomous operation, removing any need for him to venture out into the scorched, irradiated surface of the world. The initial wave from each nuclear explosion was bad enough, but the second wave from the fallout was arguably worse. Radioactive particles and debris kicked up into the air by the sheer force of each blast, only to gradually come raining or falling back down to Earth, hence the name. Exposure to nuclear fallout carried by winds could cause radiation sickness, cancer, and eventually death by contaminating the breathable air, along with irradiating any food or water left behind. Being trapped underground made it hard for Mason not to feel isolated. Even though he owned one of the smaller Black Hills bunkers, it had been designed and furnished to house more than just one person. He found himself using the extra 4 twin bedrooms almost as vacation bedrooms when he got sick of sleeping in his double room, just to alleviate the boredom. The first year in the bunker seemed to pass at a slow crawl, but it wasn't long afterward that things started breaking down. His water filtration system had malfunctioned, and none of the tools or spare parts he stored in the bunker were suitable. He had tried every last conceivable option, anything to avoid stepping outside, even as a last resort. But running out of viable solutions and becoming more and more dehydrated, it was beginning to look like he'd have to leave the safety of his bunker after all. Outside, waiting for him, were the horrors of a nuclear winter. Thanks to the widespread scale of the nuclear war on the surface and the sheer number of atom bombs detonated, this had triggered a climatic event once only thought to be purely theoretical. It goes without saying that the damage caused by a nuclear bomb when it directly hits a target and detonates is nothing short of devastating. The immediate heat from the blast is enough to vaporize human beings until little more than a scorched silhouette remains on the ground or nearby walls. The shockwave from the blast can also damage, if not entirely demolish, most standing structures too, meaning not even buildings stand a chance of staying standing if they're too close. But what also occurs when a nuclear device detonates is that massive amounts of dust and debris are thrown up into the air. A nuclear winter occurs when the explosions of several nuclear weapons cause these large quantities of dust and debris, including the aforementioned nuclear fallout, to float up into the atmosphere. This mass of debris, as well as the residual smoke from the blasts, would then theoretically form a barrier thick enough to block out the sun. This would prevent a great deal of the sun's light, and more importantly heat, from reaching the surface. With the sun's rays blocked by a thick fog of fallout and atmospheric debris, the temperatures across the planet would begin to drop rapidly, to around 50 to just under 70 degrees Fahrenheit. This is exactly what happened while Mason had been hiding in the safety of his bunker. Previous scientific theories had hypothesized that the emissions generated by nuclear fireballs would completely destroy the ozone layer surrounding the Earth. However, by the 1980s, those theories had largely been discredited, and more plausible effects of a nuclear war on the climate started to be considered. But Mason had assumed that above ground things would be scorching hot, thanks to all the heat from the explosions, but in reality, the opposite was true. Still, he knew it was suicide to step outside unprotected, even if he was in for a surprise as to just how cold it was beyond the safety of his bunker. Preparation for venturing outside after a nuclear war was not something Mason could ever be too cautious about. Being underprepared would mean exposure to nuclear fallout, so he started by taking some potassium iodine tablets. These would flood his body with safe iodine, blocking any radioactive iodine present in nuclear fallout from being absorbed into his body and poisoning him. With the dose he'd taken, it would keep Mason safe for about 24 hours. He had a reliable gas mask on hand as well, military-grade CM7M full-face one that he quickly put on, securing it tightly. Of course, the gas mask itself was useless without a filter, which he screwed into the mask to prevent him breathing in any radioactive iodine. Then he slipped into a protective hazmat suit and gloves, using chemical-resistant tape to seal any gaps between the gloves and his sleeves, and the suit's legs and his boots, making sure he was as protected as it was possible for him to be. Gathering up a survival kit he'd been gathering in a bug-out bag, consisting of useful items like a rope, flashlight, personal radio, a basic first aid kit, and a Geiger counter, Mason was ready at last to take his first nervous steps beyond his bunker and out into the world ravaged by nuclear winter. Stepping outside, the low temperature was the first shock to Mason's system. It was certainly a far cry from the insulated warmth inside his bunker. The hazmat suit over his clothes protected him somewhat, and luckily he'd sealed it well enough to keep much of his own body heat trapped. but that wouldn't entirely negate the effects of the nuclear winter's cold. In the area of South Dakota near the Black Hills, temperatures already fluctuated considerably depending on the time of year. On average, it could reach highs of 75 degrees Fahrenheit in the summer and drop all the way to the lower 30s at the start or tail end of the year. With just that disparity in the space of a few months, the time of year and regular temperature would be a crucial factor in how severe the effects of a nuclear winter would be. And those are the highs, too. In colder areas, if the temperature is already lower, then that number is only going to go down thanks to the lack of heat from the sun. Mason had found himself in what theorists had classed as a nominal nuclear winter. In the case of a minimal one, a small nuclear attack would have no effect on the environment. While a marginal scenario would still see lower temperatures, even a nominal nuclear winter was still thought to be on the lower end of the scale in terms of the damage and impact a full-scale nuclear war would have on the climate, and would likely occur after the detonation of between 6,000 and 12,000 nuclear weapons. The fluctuating streak of bad to good luck that Mason was experiencing seemed to be continuing, since he'd exited his bunker with too few layers to keep himself warm enough, but he'd also left on a day in April. The average lowest temperature in the area would have normally been around 48 degrees, but now, with the huge clouds of ash and radioactive debris acting as an umbrella blocking out the sunlight, it was significantly colder. In fact, in the year since the bombs had first fallen, nuclear winter had made the temperatures consistently lower all across South Dakota, as well as the world. If he'd been outside on a May day before the bombs had dropped, the lowest average temperature would be around 21 degrees. With a nuclear winter in effect, it was now barely reaching 3 Fahrenheit, something that would cause Mason far more problems than just feeling a little cold. Thanks to the thick blanket of radioactive dust in the atmosphere, the sky had gone dark. Little to no sunlight reaching the surface of the Earth meant visibility was poor, and while Mason didn't quite need to rely on his flashlight in order to get around, it was far darker than an overcast day. Even at noon, when the sun had reached its highest point in the sky, the sunlight was only about a third of what it would have been on a normal day for that time of year, and this lower level of light wasn't seasonal, it persisted all year long. As much as the sun would have made it easier to see, Mason didn't find himself wishing it would return. Thanks to the number of nuclear weapons exploding, the air around them would have been subjected to intense heat, followed by rapid cooling. These were the perfect conditions for nitrogen oxides to form. Such high levels of nitrogen oxides, coupled with the heat being absorbed by the dark layer of soot in the atmosphere, would have destroyed around 70% of the ozone layer. So when the smoke of the nuclear winter eventually cleared, there would be an increased amount of ultraviolet radiation reaching the surface, emitted by the sun. This could cause damage to people and animals alike, affecting their eyes and also increase their likelihood of developing skin cancer, in addition to outright killing a lot of the animal and plant life, if there was any left at that point. Braving the icy temperatures only protected by the hazmat suit and layers of clothes he had on underneath, Mason headed off in search of other bunkers. There were 557 available when he bought his, so Mason figured he at least wouldn't have to venture much further than the former Black Hills Army base. His main objective was to find enough tools or replacement parts to repair his water filtration system, but he had decided it was worth attempting to restock on supplies. He knew to avoid anything that wasn't packaged. Any food or water that had been exposed to the outside elements was likely riddled with radioactive fallout and would at best require a lot of washing before even coming close to preparing and eating. So he thought it was best to stick to any canned or dried food he happened across, just as long as it was in sealed packaging. When it came to water, he obviously couldn't trust any outdoor sources. Now they'd be all irradiated. But he hadn't exactly been downing tall glasses of parasite and bacteria-riddled river water even before the war, so avoiding rivers and lakes came instinctively. The same could be said for any crops that had been growing nearby at the time of the bombs dropping. The dimming of the sun also meant that the plants couldn't photosynthesize properly. That was evident to Mason just by looking at what few trees had been near the Black Hills bunkers. They were all dead, and those that were still standing were scorched by the blaze. Walking around in the wake of the war was unnerving. Every tick of the Geiger counter put Mason on edge, causing him to take sharp, nervous breaths. Then, hearing his own breathing contained by his mask made him think about everything he could potentially be breathing in if his filter stopped working. It wasn't just radioactive fallout contaminating the air, but pollutants of all sorts. While the temperature below the smoke and dust was extremely cold, above it was much hotter, thanks to the sunlight being absorbed by the fallout in the atmosphere. This temperature inversion helped keep any of the byproducts of fires closer to the level people breathe at, and a lot of fires had occurred when the bombs had incinerated large swaths of the planet, meaning that dioxins, sulfurous gases, and other pollutants were not only prevented from fully rising upward into the atmosphere, but were dense and toxic to anyone unfortunate enough to breathe them in. Mason prayed he wouldn't find out just how toxic the air was, as long as he kept his mask on and didn't remove his filter. Arriving at one of the other bunkers, Mason was met with a heavy sealed door. Trying in vain to get it to budge, he decided it was probably pointless in knocking. After all, his underground neighbor probably wasn't expecting any social calls now that civilization had collapsed. Searching further, Mason found another of the bunkers a short walk away. Judging by the open door, this one was unoccupied. He tried not to think about whether or not it had been that way because it was still waiting to be sold when the bombs dropped, or if it had been opened after by someone forcing their way in. Stepping into the compromised bunker, Mason looked around, thoroughly checking some of the nearest bedrooms for any signs of life. Nobody in. Strangely, any sense of comfort that provided him was fleeting, disappearing the moment he saw that the interior of the bunker had been ransacked. Searching for supplies and other useful resources was hardly going to be an easy task, even if someone hadn't already beaten him to it. Since the door to this bunker had been wide open, there was a high chance much of the radiation from outside had come flooding inside the moment the bunker had been exposed to the toxic elements. Even here, Mason had to keep his suit on, and while he was grateful for the slight increase in temperature that came from being inside, his warmer body temperature caused the lenses of his gas mask to get foggy. That was the least of his problems, though. It didn't seem like there was anything that useful down here. Navigating was easy enough, at least. The layout of the bunker was almost identical to his, so finding his way around came naturally. After all, apart from the mess, it was just like the space he'd spent the last year of his life trapped in. As Mason searched throughout the raided supply closets, sifting through the mess that had been left behind, his hope for finding anything that could help him dwindled. Every time he reached for what looked at a distance to be an unopened can of food, he would lift it to feel its empty weight. As he threw each one back to the floor, his heart sank further. Mason was hardly the last man alive, after all. Those who hadn't been killed or blinded by the blasts would have suffered severe burns to their skin if they'd been anywhere near the blast radius, and somehow managed to avoid the devastation of the initial shockwave. There were many pockets of survivors located all over the globe. In some countries with good civil defense systems in place, like Switzerland or Finland, there was already an extensive network of blast shelters and fallout shelters. The latter even had enough shelters to house its entire urban population. Both Australia and New Zealand had a fairly low population density, with these two countries also having massive food reserves stored away out of reach of fallout from the Northern Hemisphere. And all over in Iceland, they hardly had to worry about food. Thanks to their autonomous food production systems, they could continue to meet the demand of their survivors. Elsewhere, though, the struggle for acquiring resources had been expectedly competitive among the few who had managed to survive by regularly venturing on the surface and braving the nuclear winter's Arctic temperatures, although not many of them survived for long. With production of food and other essentials all but shut down completely, that meant there were limited resources available to those who needed them, and mass starvation had already claimed many lives. It didn't just go for food either. Electricity was scarce, if not completely unavailable. Those like Mason who had generators providing their bunkers were lucky, and needed fuel to keep those generators working. His search for food proving quite literally fruitless, Mason started to look for other things he could use. Spare water filters, tools, literally anything that could improve the state of his bunker. There was nothing. Whoever had beaten him to the punch had cleared the place out top to bottom and destroyed anything of use. He started to wonder if the bunker had been empty and just gotten obliterated in a nuclear blast, and sometime after someone had come and cleared out anything left that was still useful. Now walking back out into the cold of the nuclear winter outside, Mason was faced with a choice. He still needed to fix his filtration system, otherwise he'd die a slow, painful death via dehydration. The problem was the next bunker was a longer walk away, and he was already freezing. His body temperature was plummeting, so he could either race back to his own bunker, decontaminate himself and his hazmat suit, then try again another day, or he could try to reach the next nearest bunker, which could easily be in the same state as the one he just left. But it might have what he needed. Mason made the mistake of continuing his search. Despite the protection against fallout offered by his suit and the iodine pills he'd taken earlier, the one thing neither of them could prevent was long exposure to cold temperatures caused by nuclear winter. His core body temperature, which usually hovered around 98 degrees, would begin falling thanks to the freezing temperatures outside his suit. Once the body dips to 95 degrees Fahrenheit, hypothermia occurs. aided by the sweat that had accumulated thanks to the body heat trapped inside his hazmat suit. As his body temperature dropped, his vital organs began to fail until Mason couldn't breathe properly. Collapsing as he desperately tried to turn back to his bunker, he eventually died. It wasn't the radiation or even the nuclear bombs themselves that got him in the end. It was merely the cold of the nuclear winter. When you think of nuclear disasters, the first thing that probably comes to mind is Chernobyl. However, this was not the first nuclear disaster, nor was it the last. It seems that several nuclear tragedies have either been overlooked or intentionally left out of history books for various reasons. Nuclear power can be a great source of energy, but it can also lead to catastrophe. You're about to find out about the most deadly nuclear accidents of all time, and the crazy part is you probably haven't heard of most of them. Many consider an accident at Chalk River Laboratories in the 1950s to be one of the first nuclear accidents that ever occurred. Chalk River Laboratories is located just over 100 miles northwest of Ottawa, Canada. In the 1950s, it was a state-of-the-art facility where scientists, engineers, and researchers worked on developing future nuclear technology. But with the new technology comes a risk, and when dealing with nuclear energy, these risks can be huge. On December 12, 1952, the National Research Experimental Reactor at Chalk River encountered a power flow issue that resulted in a runaway fission reaction. The temperature in the coolant tank began to rise slowly at first, but as researchers tried to get it under control, things went from bad to worse. Sirens started to blare as the temperatures in the reactor core rose to dangerous levels. The engineers tried to lower the control rods into the coolant tank, but they jammed and the chain reactions continued. Suddenly, 3 of the rods began to lift out of the coolant tank unexpectedly. The engineers panicked as the rods continued to rise and overheat. In the next instant, the core went into meltdown. Hydrogen explosions rocked the building. The reactor seal blew off its hinges and dumped 1.2 million gallons of radioactive waste into the basement of the Chalk River facility. The scientists and researchers knew that the radioactive water was dangerous, but proper waste disposal procedures had not yet been put in place. Engineers at Chalk River dug ditches only 5,000 feet away from the Ottawa River where they dumped the water from the reactor. Unsurprisingly, some of the radioactive waste leached into the Ottawa River system and the surrounding area. The radiation spread throughout the region and flowed toward the United States. Interestingly, future President Jimmy Carter was stationed as a naval officer in Schenectady, New York at the time, where he and 26 other men helped clean up the Chalk River nuclear accident. It's unknown how many people were affected by the disaster, but the insane part is that the facility reopened 2 years later with very few modifications made to the procedures and mechanisms. Therefore, it wasn't surprising that in 1958, Chalk River Laboratory suffered another nuclear accident. The National Research Universal Reactor was housed in a separate building than the first reactor, but a similar set of circumstances led to problems with this reactor as well. The fuel rods began to overheat just like at the National Research Experimental Reactor from years before. The scientists realized they were headed toward a second meltdown and used a robotic crane to lift one of the metallic uranium rods out of the reactor. However, as the crane moved the rod away from the reactor, the uranium caught fire and fell into the core below. The entire facility was doused with radiation and the surrounding area became contaminated once again. Even worse, the valves for the facility's ventilation system were left wide open, resulting in large amounts of radioactive steam being released into the air. The researchers and engineers scrambled to extinguish the fire before the rest of the reactor rods went into meltdown. They dumped buckets of wet sand into the hole in the reactor's containment vessel, and the fire was eventually put out. But large amounts of radiation had already leaked from the reactor core. Military personnel had to be brought in to aid with the cleanup of all the radioactive waste. It's hard to tell just how many people suffered due to the radiation leaks at Chalk River Laboratories in the 50s. The people who worked there and those who helped with the cleanup were both exposed to unhealthy levels of radiation. No reports indicate that anyone immediately died from radiation exposure, but as time went on, medical issues began to arise, such as higher rates of cancer and other illnesses connected to radiation poisoning in the people who worked at or lived near the Chalk River Nuclear Research Facility. We may never know the extent to which the Chalk River Laboratory accidents affected people in the environment. We'll also probably never know if the radiation leaked into the nearby river systems and ended up affecting people living downstream. Either way, these last 2 nuclear accidents were some of the first to occur, but most certainly would not be the last. Between those 2 nuclear accidents at Chalk River in the 50s, a much worse disaster occurred in the Soviet Union in 1957. After World War II, the Soviet Union began constructing nuclear facilities like crazy. They needed to outdo the Americans, or at least keep up with them if they were going to remain a dominant power in the world. Nuclear facilities at the time were used to conduct research and develop weapons. The Mayak nuclear fuel processing plant was located in the town of Ossiorsk in southwestern Russia. On September 29th, the cooling system at the facility failed. The core began to overheat as workers tried to get the chain reaction under control. Unfortunately, they failed. The reactor exploded, sending a massive cloud of radioactive particles into the air. Unlike the Chalk River disaster that was somewhat contained, these particles swept across the Russian landscape, contaminating entire towns as wind currents carried them across the country. The deadly particles spread over 300 square miles. The Soviet government waited an entire week before declaring a state of emergency and evacuating the 10,000 residents who had been in the path of the radioactive cloud. But at that point, it was too late. The Mayak facility was highly classified, and the Soviet government did not want word to spread of its existence. The evacuated citizens were given no clear reason as to why they were being moved or that they should be concerned about radiation. The Soviet people were eventually resettled. But as time went on, the population started to develop some mysterious ailments. People's skin began to redden and die. Entire portions of their skin and muscles fell off the bone as a result of high radiation exposure. It was now clear what had happened in the region and what the Soviet government was trying to hide. In order to cover their tracks, Soviet leaders created the East Ural Nature Reserve, which encompassed the entire contaminated area. This was done solely to prohibit access to the region. It wasn't until 2 decades later that a Russian biologist named Zores Medvedev blew the whistle on his own government and exposed what happened at the Mayak facility. It's estimated that 200 people died from cancer as a direct result of radiation exposure from the Mayak nuclear accident. However, it's highly likely that thousands more were exposed to dangerous levels of radiation and suffered from illnesses caused by the nuclear accident. The incident has come to be known as the Kishtim disaster because until recently, Ozyorsk didn't appear on any official maps. The Soviet government did their best to suppress any information about the facility or the disaster that occurred there. This is why the nuclear accident was named after Kishtim, the next closest town that appeared on maps. The same year as the Kishtim disaster in the Soviet Union, Great Britain had their own nuclear mishap. On October 10, 1957, Britain's first nuclear reactor, known as Windscale, was working to create more material for their nuclear weapons program. The facility had been running since the 40s without any problems, but on this day, things went terribly wrong. Workers at the facility were running routine maintenance on the reactor when they noticed temperatures began to rise. The temperatures were still within reasonable levels, but they didn't seem to be leveling off. The workers tried circulating fresh coolant to keep the temperatures down, yet nothing seemed to work. It quickly became apparent that something was very wrong. One of the scientists realized that the uranium-filled graphite core within the reactor had caught fire. But this wasn't a new development. The fire had been burning within the core for at least 2 days prior, since the moment the core had caught fire, it had been releasing radioactive contaminants into the air. At this point, there was nothing that could be done about the radiation already spewed into the atmosphere. The engineers at Windscale needed to keep the core from completely melting down to stop any further contamination. They brought in cooling fans, compressed carbon dioxide, and cold water to drop the core's temperature. After days of work, the staff at Windscale smothered the fire and brought the core's temperature back to safe levels. It was now October 12th, and a radioactive cloud was drifting across the UK and into Europe. There was no way to evacuate the enormous area that was being covered by radioactive particles. One set of precautions taken at the time was to pull all the milk and dairy products from the shelves of stores for a month. Even still, it's estimated that the Windscale disaster caused around 250 cases of cancer. This is probably a lowball assessment. Upon inspection of the Windscale disaster, it was found that the accident could have been avoided. The fire that began in the core should never have happened, and the fact that it was allowed to burn for several days put the lives of countless people at risk. Like with the Kishtim incident in the Soviet Union, Windscale was hidden from the public for several decades. This was likely because Britain didn't want its own nuclear weapons program hindered by restrictions and red tape. At the time, nuclear war seemed almost inevitable to many, and the importance of developing nuclear weapons far outweighed the risks. Not all nuclear accidents occurred on land, however. Deep in the North Atlantic, a nuclear-powered submarine almost sunk as a result of a deadly accident. K-19 was a Hotel-class Soviet submarine. This was the classification that NATO intelligence gave nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. On July 4, 1961, K-19 was traveling in the frigid waters of the North Atlantic when its nuclear engine began to overheat. There was a malfunction in the coolant system and there was no backup, so the sub's crew did the only thing they could: figured out a way to fix the coolant leak. The reactor started to become alarmingly hot, and if the crew didn't find a way to redirect coolant to the nuclear core, it would explode and release an enormous amount of radiation throughout the submarine and into the ocean. Brave engineers and other crew members locked themselves in the engine room and worked on fixing the reactor as radiation ripped through their bodies. These men knew they would receive a lethal dose of radiation, but it didn't matter. They would do whatever it took to save their crewmates. Eventually, they were able to jerry-rig the coolant system to divert the necessary cold water to the core. and bring the temperature down. The submarine couldn't travel back to the Soviet Union on its own, but at least the core wouldn't explode and destroy the sub. A rescue mission was launched to bring K-19 back to port. Another sub towed K-19 across the Atlantic and returned it to the shores of the Soviet Union. When the crew disembarked K-19, the men working on fixing the core were found to have been bombarded by radiation. In the coming months, many would become seriously ill and die as a result of their heroic actions. Other members of the K-19 who were not exposed to as much radiation survived for many more years. However, all the men aboard K-19 would eventually succumb to diseases associated with radiation exposure. But this is not where this particular disaster ends. Although the submarine did not explode and the crew members were able to live for a few years after the accident, other tragedies occurred as a result of the K-19 accident. The sub that towed K-19 back to base also became contaminated by the radiation. Many of the men aboard the rescue sub also became ill due to radiation. Even after K-19 was docked to be repaired, the nuclear core continued to release radiation. The people on the naval base and the workers who fixed the sub all became contaminated. Although we'll never know how many people died as a direct result of the radiation leak aboard K-19, it would seem anyone who came into contact with the sub received enough radiation to alter their health. It's possible that dozens or even hundreds of people were affected by the nuclear accident aboard K-19. In 1979, the United States would experience its own nuclear disaster. This would be one of the worst accidents at a nuclear power plant in the world. Up until this point, most nuclear accidents were a result of nuclear material being created for weapons or to power vessels of war. However, the accident at 3 Mile Island would cause controversy around nuclear energy and the dangers that come with it. To this day, the events at 3 Mile Island have eroded the public's confidence in nuclear energy. On March 28, 1979, a pressure valve at the 3 Mile Island nuclear power plant near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania failed to close. The nuclear plant was supposed to be state-of-the-art and promised to bring the United States an efficient, affordable energy source. When the pressure valve in one of the reactors failed, it caused cooling water contaminated with radiation to flow through different parts of the facility. The workers in the control room realized what was happening and desperately tried to redirect the contaminated water. But in the chaos, the workers made a series of errors that made matters worse. The irradiated water continued to spread. They diverted water all night, but by the following morning, the core had reached over 4,000 degrees. If the temperature increased to 5,000 degrees, it would melt down, leading to a catastrophic explosion that would send radioactive debris across the country. The power plant was spewing radioactive steam into the air, but things could get much worse. The owners of the power plant downplayed the critical nature of the situation. First, they claimed the meltdown was under control when it was not, and then they said no radiation was leaking out of the power plant. However, within days, radiation was detected in 4 different counties around 3 Mile Island. The governor of Pennsylvania immediately issued an order for pregnant women and small children to be evacuated from the area since they would be the most vulnerable to radiation. As this was happening, the cooling system at the nuclear power plant was still not working properly. People fled their homes and headed to safety. On March 31st, the emergency teams finally got the valves back online and were able to cool the core before it exploded. No direct deaths or injuries were recorded during this time at 3 Mile Island, but the fact that radioactive particles were released into the atmosphere and dispersed across the state cannot be overlooked. Some studies suggest that there might be a correlation between increased cancer and infant mortality rates in the region and the release of radiation from the nuclear power plant. If this is true, then the 3 Mile Island incident not only caused the American people to become wary of nuclear energy, but also might have led to the early deaths of many citizens, making it the deadliest nuclear accident on American soil. Faulty parts caused some nuclear accidents, others were caused by carelessness. This was the case with a nuclear contamination event in Goiânia, Brazil in 1987. A radiotherapy institution within the city decided to relocate and leave some of their old equipment behind. However, they did not follow the proper waste disposal protocols when disposing of the equipment, especially those containing radioactive material. On September 13th, 2 scavengers entered the abandoned building and removed one of the teletherapy units that still contained highly radioactive cesium chloride. The 2 men carried the radioactive unit to a junkyard in a wheelbarrow where they sold it to the junkyard owner. The problem was that the teletherapy device was spewing radiation the entire trip from the abandoned building to the junkyard. When the junkyard owner saw that this newly acquired device contained glowing blue material, he invited his friends and family over to see it. The scavengers, the junkyard owner, and everyone who came into contact with the device had no idea they were being exposed to high amounts of radiation. After the incident, hundreds of people began to show signs of radiation sickness. This nuclear accident wasn't due to a core meltdown or weapons, but leftover medical equipment. It's estimated that 245 people were exposed to radiation. This led to high rates of cancer in Goiânia at the time, something that could have been prevented just by eliminating the negligence around the disposing of radioactive materials. And this brings us to the worst nuclear disaster that's ever occurred. It was at 1 a.m. on April 25, 1986, and the Chernobyl nuclear power plant operators began reducing power on reactor number 4 for routine maintenance and a safety test. The safety test was being conducted to identify if the still spinning turbines could create enough power to keep the coolant pumps running if the plant was to lose power. At 2 p.m. on April 25th, reactor number 4's cooling system was shut down so that it didn't interfere with the test. Everything seemed to be going according to plan. There was a change in personnel around 11 p.m. when the night shift took over the test. They were less experienced and never received proper instructions on how to carry out the test safely. On April 26, 1:23 a.m., the test officially began. As soon as it started, a sudden power surge occurred. An operator pressed the emergency shutdown button, but the control rods jammed as they entered the core and exploded. The blast caused the 1,000-ton roof to be blown off the nuclear power plant. A fireball erupted into the sky, radiation spewed out of the core, and irradiated particles filled the sky. Fires broke out across the Chernobyl power station as workers tried desperately to get the reactor to stabilize. In order to get control of the situation, the Soviet government blockaded the nearby town without informing the police or anyone involved of the potential risks of radiation poisoning. By 6:35 a.m., all fires were extinguished and the rest of the reactors were shut down, but radiation continued to pour out of Reactor 4. The firefighters and workers believed the radiation was under control, but they were misinformed. When it became clear that the nuclear reactor was still expelling massive amounts of radiation, the government ordered the evacuation of the surrounding areas. On April 28th, Swedish air monitors detected large amounts of radiation coming from the Soviet Union. The USSR informs the world that there had been a nuclear accident at Chernobyl. Over the next several days, 800,000 workers were brought in to help with the cleanup. They pumped liquid nitrogen underneath the power plant to try to cool the core. Mounds of sand were dumped into the reactor from helicopters. It wasn't until May 6 that the radioactive emissions began to decline as the fire in the core burned itself out. The emergency workers began constructing a concrete structure around the core to contain the radioactive fallout. Official records claim that only 31 people died as a result of the Chernobyl accident, but the number is likely much higher due to the number of workers involved and the amount of radiation they were exposed to. Many people likely died years later from cancers caused by the radiation from the Chernobyl explosion, while countless acres of land became uninhabitable due to radioactivity. As technology advanced and we created safer reactors, nuclear accidents have decreased. There are around 440 nuclear reactors in the world today. The last one to melt down was the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant in Okuma, Fukushima, Japan. This disaster was the result of a tsunami and earthquake that decimated the northeastern part of the country. The meltdown resulted in the deaths of 2 workers but leaked radioactive waste into water supplies in the surrounding area. Launching nuclear weapons is undoubtedly the single most powerful authority that a president of the United States has. Even scarier is that he or she can almost have no checks or balances on the strike, but more on that later. The mysterious black briefcase that's always within arm's reach of the president has mystified people for decades and has become a symbol of both the president's great responsibility and a symbol of a bygone era that some believe should be cast into the history books. So what exactly is the nuclear football? For starters, it's not shaped like a football at all. The device is an all-aluminum case that's placed inside a black leather bag. The bag itself is carried by a military officer of at least the 04 pay grade that serves as an aide to the president. Indeed, the aide is always with the president whenever he's out of the White House. No matter whether it's a trip to meet foreign dignitaries at high-level conferences, fancy hotels, or even just a trip to get a pizza, the military aide will be right by the president's side. Just why the presidents have a nuclear football in the first place actually arose during the Kennedy administration at the height of the Cold War. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, where both the US and Russia were probably within days, if not hours, of nuclear war, Kennedy realized that the situations in which nuclear weapons might be needed could develop so quickly that something that allowed the president access from anywhere in the world was needed. Additionally, President Kennedy wanted a system whereby the proper command authorities and troops launching the actual missiles could verify the president's identity. After all, one would not want an imposter giving false orders to annihilate the whole world. Kennedy also wanted a way that he could quickly meet with his top command advisors to make the most informed decision possible. Hence, the nuclear football was born. Though the device has been around since the 60s, there are a great number of misconceptions about the device. The first one is that there was only one of them. In reality, there are actually 3 nuclear footballs. The first one always stays with the president, the second one is always with the vice president if the president becomes incapacitated. The last one is actually a spare that stays at the White House. Contrary to popular belief, there is no magic red button that the president can press and rain hellfire on anyone in the world. Rather, it's a little more complicated than that. If the president decides to launch nuclear weapons, once he or she opens the briefcase, the president will be greeted with rather impressive communication equipment and official documentation. When the president wants to give the order to strike, the first thing that'll happen is the aide will take the president aside and help lay out all the documentation for him or her. After establishing secure communications with the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military officers from each branch, the president will decide whether to meet in the Situation Room and continue the strike via secure telephone conference. Once positive communications have been established with the command authority, the president must establish his or her identity. The way this is done is through the so-called biscuit. The biscuit is a small, laminated index card that the president also carries on his body. It's a response to the challenge posed by the Joint Chiefs of Staff. It's typically a two-letter response to a two-letter challenge. For example, the challenge would be Delta Foxtrot, and the response could be Echo Bravo. Those codes, which are classified to the highest level possible, must be correct or the strike will not continue since the president cannot verify his identity. Once the president's identity has been verified, the president will quickly discuss the situation and the possible response to it. While certainly nuclear options will be on the table, the generals and admirals could convince the president to take another course of action. If they cannot convince him to agree, the order will continue through a series of secure encrypted messages sent to the units responsible for the firing. To decide what kind of response the president wants, there is a literal black book inside the briefcase. This book contains a pre-planned list of responses to a number of attacks. The best way one former aide could describe this list was sort of like picking from a Denny's menu, where the president could assemble a nuclear attack by picking options from each column. Also contained within the Black Book is a super secret list of safe houses within the United States. No matter where the president's traveling, he or she can find somewhere to hunker down while giving this command. Once the encrypted orders have been sent out from the Pentagon, the firing units then receive them and decrypt them. For land-based nuclear missiles, silo teams take the encoded pre-planned responses and compare them to the coded messages locked inside a safe. At all times, at least 2 people must be present when opening the safe and decoding the message. After the message is decoded, it's put up to a vote by the silo team to fire the missiles. 5 keys must be turned simultaneously to fire the missiles, but only 2 of them must agree to fire. For missiles based on a submarine, the initial decoding is quite similar. The order must be retrieved with at least 2 people, and the commanding officer, executive officer, and 2 department heads must decode the message. Only a unanimous vote amongst all 4 officers that the message is authentic and legal will allow the strike to continue. Though this seems like a tremendous amount of power to be in one person's hands, and there can be no doubt that this is, it's not the ultimate godlike authority that some people claim the president has in this matter. The reason for this is because despite what some people say, there are checks and balances in place, though not what they're used to for civilians. The president serves as the commander-in-chief of the armed forces, and as such, a civilian who controls military members are subject to the Uniform Code of Military Justice and the regulations of their respective services. Though people would be correct in stating that there are no civilian checks and balances, since not even the Vice President or Secretary of Defense can veto a legal launch order, there are balances within the military hierarchy. The first balance comes in the form of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. These senior officers are the most experienced and most capable officers that the entire military can muster. These men and women have a combined service record of almost 200 years of experience and have been through countless tough and high-stress situations. With their combined experiences, these flag officers are the best suited to advise the president on options other than a nuclear strike. However, if these officers cannot convince the president of any other option, they still cannot obey an unlawful order. For an order to be lawful, it must be issued by a competent authority as well as be clear, specific, and have a valid military purpose. If the order does not meet all of these criteria, it is not legal, and the officers will not notify the Pentagon to issue the messages to the firing units. By doing this, inadvertent orders such as those from an angry, drunk, or otherwise incapacitated president will not be obeyed. If the president is simply feuding with another country, like getting roasted by North Korea on Twitter again, the Joint Chiefs of Staff will simply ignore it. Once the order has gotten passed here, there are no more checks and balances on the desire to launch nuclear weapons, but there are on actually firing them. As mentioned earlier, both land-based missile crews and submarine officers can veto the order to fire if they do not believe it's legal or authentic. While these troops cannot deny based solely on the targets, they can deny launching the missiles if they do not believe it was actually the president who gave the order. But despite the vast array of checks and balances, there have been numerous times when the nuclear football has nearly been compromised. The most famous example was during Reagan's attempted assassination. After he was shot, he was quickly taken to the emergency room, and his military aide was left at the scene. Once at the hospital, his clothes were cut off, as is standard procedure, and his belongings were emptied into plastic bags. Among his belongings inside his sock was the biscuit needed to authenticate the president's identity. This crucial information vital to national security was unceremoniously left in the hallway. President Clinton also left his biscuit behind when he was rushing to leave an international conference in Paris. When he met Russian leader Khrushchev, Nixon got separated from his nuclear football, and he accidentally sped off in his car. With his security team struggling to catch up, the United States had no nuclear option for about half an hour. While these might seem understandable, probably the most egregious offense came during President Carter's administration when he accidentally forgot his biscuit in his suit pocket that he sent to the dry cleaners. Most recently, the nuclear football has once again become the subject of debate during President Trump's administration. When he was diagnosed with a novel coronavirus, he was sent to the hospital with a military aide in tow. Throughout his entire stay, he never once gave up his authority as president as guaranteed in the 25th Amendment. Rather, he kept his command authority, and even in quarantine while taking experimental drugs, he could have given the order to launch nuclear weapons. It is for this reason that the debate of whether the nuclear football in today's day and age is even necessary. After all, even during the Cold War, the chance that the Soviet Union would launch a surprise, preemptive attack was negligible, since both sides knew that each other would just be wiped off the map. Rather, why the device is stuck around is a physical reminder of just how much authority is really vested in the office of the president. Some argue that the authority to launch nuclear weapons should only be a power vested in the collective minds of Congress. While this argument makes sense on the surface, since Congress has the sole authority to declare war, and launching nuclear weapons being the ultimate de facto declaration of war, there are a number of reasons that are still valid against this argument. Firstly is that Congress is a public forum. Debating whether to use nuclear weapons would alert other countries to what America wanted to do. Even during an emergency session of Congress, the news media would have a field day over this. By doing so, adversary nations would get the crucial time required to preemptively strike and take out American nuclear arms before they're hit. The next reason why this would not be a good idea is a common theme in politics, in that politics takes too long. In quick, fast-developing situations, there might not be time to decide on what to do. Rather, at that moment, there can only be a knowledgeable and balanced man or woman who can decide whether or not to use the ultimate weapon, or so it's hoped. Though this scenario might seem remote, it's still the only chance the United States has of defending itself in the direst of situations. For that reason, at least into the near future, the nuclear football will continue to serve alongside presidents until an alternative solution is reached. Fukushima. The name alone is enough to conjure fear in the hearts of anyone living along the west coast of North America or on the eastern seaboard of Asia. To many, Fukushima is our generation's Chernobyl and a reminder of the deadly consequences of tapping into the almighty atom to fuel our modern lifestyles. Following the nuclear disaster at the Fukushima Daiichi power plant, some surveys have shown that public opinion on nuclear power is dropping in Europe, and many countries are now planning to decrease their reliance on nuclear power. In the US, the public remains almost evenly split after taking a tumble from almost 60% in favor for nuclear power pre-Fukushima. And yet, while the overall health effects of Fukushima were far less than expected, and certainly far short of every alarmist's worst predictions, the world at large remains extremely fearful of the nuclear monster. Starting construction shortly before the Fukushima disaster, though, Russia's floating nuclear power plant will be fired up this fall. Predictably, it has come under intense international opposition from groups such as Greenpeace, who fear another nuclear disaster polluting the ocean with radioactive waste. But are these fears well-founded? And is Russia flirting with a disaster that could leave its northern coasts barren of life for decades or more? Displayed boldly on its side, the academic Lomonosov sports a diagram of an atom, the international symbol for nuclear power. With a hull that's 474 feet long and a displacement of 21,500 tons, the academic is the world's only floating nuclear power plant. Nuclear power has been used at sea before. Notably, the Soviet Union created battle cruisers and icebreakers fueled by nuclear power, and the US Navy has for decades relied on nuclear power to operate its mighty aircraft carriers. Both the Russian and American Navy, as well as a few other navies, all operate nuclear-powered submarines. Yet the academic differs in that its sole purpose is to serve as a floating power plant, rather than power the ship it's installed on. The ultimate destination for the academic is the northern port of Pevek, deep in the Arctic Circle. There, power cables will be run to the vessel, and the nuclear reactor will power the port and town built around it. Though a land-based nuclear power plant already exists there, the academic will replace that facility and allow the decommission of its aging reactors. Those are not the only plans for the academic, though, as the Russians see the floating nuclear power station being sent to other port cities and industrial plants to provide much-needed electricity. Eventually, Russia plans on building a small fleet of these floating nuclear power plants and use them to power remote facilities and even offshore gas and oil platforms. With a power output of 70 megawatts, just one of these ships can provide enough electricity for 100,000 people. Yet, even within Russia, there's been stiff opposition to the academic, and both foreign and even Russian cities lodged complaints over the initial route that the academic was going to take, forcing a new route and delay in its delivery. Greenpeace, meanwhile, has collected over 11,000 signatures in Russia alone, all calling for the plant to be scrapped altogether. Similar opposition in the US scrapped plans to build a floating nuclear power plant off of New Jersey shore back in the 1960s, but the Russian government has not shown any signs of shutting down the academic. So could the academic Lomonosov be a floating Chernobyl? First, the academic uses a new generation of nuclear reactors, which enjoys the benefits of vastly updated safety systems. The KLT-40 reactor on board the academic differs greatly from the reactors used in either the Fukushima Daiichi power plant or the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, which was itself a disaster caused by completely avoidable human error. In fact, the reactor used aboard the academic is similar to those used aboard Russia's nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. And as has been shown in the past, these reactors are able to be sunk to the bottom of the sea and raised, then put back into operation safely. In fact, for a nuclear reactor to pose a serious environmental hazard, a slew of very specific catastrophes must take place in order to breach the containment vessel, and the greatest fear facing the academic, that of a tsunami sinking the ship it's housed in, simply could not lead to such a breach. The KLT-40 reactors aboard the academic have the same features of most other nuclear reactors, such as control rods, which can be lowered in an emergency in order to absorb neutrons and thus stop the nuclear chain reaction at the heart of the reactor. As a pressurized water reactor, though, the KLT-40 also features 3 additional different methods of achieving a termination of nuclear fission, by flooding the reactor with cooling water impregnated with boron from 3 different sources. Compare that with the boiling water reactors at Fukushima, which were designed in the 1960s and featured only a single source and method to cool the control rods that stopped nuclear fission. But is a tsunami in the Arctic even possible? Well, given its remoteness, it's no surprise that there's very little data available on Arctic tsunamis and their frequency. What is known is that the Arctic is considered one of the most stable undersea geologic regions in the world, with very infrequent earthquakes which peak at about a magnitude of 7.5. The greatest threat of tsunamis come from undersea landslides, with scientists discovering evidence of a particularly powerful tsunami occurring 8,200 years ago, with waves estimated at 20 meters. Other tsunamis have occurred in Arctic regions, such as the 2017 Greenland tsunami, which killed 4 people. Yet this was a tsunami generated by a huge landslide across a fjord from the village it struck, and it was not generated by undersea activity such as happened in Fukushima. With no mountains across the water from the academic's planned location, there's no risk of a similar event striking the ship. Even if it did, though, tsunamis are very rarely ever dangerous to ships, and in the famous 2004 December tsunami that struck East Asia, thousands of boaters and even recreational divers a mile or 2 from the shore barely even noticed the passing tsunami. That's because the energy of the tsunami wave passed by in a column a few feet wide under the surface and was channeled into a mighty wave by the increasingly shallow coastline as it neared land. If the academic was caught in a tsunami, it would likely barely even notice the passing wave beneath its hull. In the end, nuclear power has been used at sea in far riskier applications for decades now, powering military warships all around the world. Several disasters at sea and the loss of nuclear craft have all proven the safety of nuclear power, and these were exclusively ships that were operating in extreme circumstances. The academic will be required to perform no such hardships and will instead sedately sit anchored offshore for years at a time. Fears of the academic harboring a nuclear disaster are greatly misplaced, and in fact, the use of nuclear power will help ensure that global warming coal, oil, or gas plants are not needed to power remote ports along Russia's northern coast. New developments in spent nuclear fuel recycling also promise to eliminate nearly all of the most long-lived radioactive elements, requiring safe storage of spent fuel for decades, rather than centuries or more as is currently the case. As the world faces the now uncertain effects of global warming, nuclear power promises to help fill the gaps between renewable sources, and accidents such as Fukushima should serve as a call to action to upgrade any remaining and obsolete reactors, not to ban nuclear power altogether.
In the early morning of the 26th of April 1986, the Chernobyl nuclear power plant in the former Soviet territory of Ukraine exploded, creating what is usually described as the worst nuclear disaster the world has ever seen. The disaster spread radioactivity into the atmosphere in one of the largest bursts of unintentional radioactive release into the environment. Russia, Ukraine, and Belarus were subject to significant exposure following the event, and the rest of Europe was on red alert. Years of independent research and government investigation followed as the world tried to calculate the extent of the damage caused by the disaster. Today on the Infographics Show, we take a look at the aftermath of this tragic event and see if the event was as disastrous as first predicted. Let's take a look at the worst effects of the Chernobyl disaster. Just over 8 miles north of Kiev and about 12 miles south of Belarus, 4 reactors stood next to a reservoir fed by the Pripyat River and close to the town of the same name with a population of 50,000 when the disaster struck. The town of Chernobyl was inhabited by 12,000, and the rest of the land surrounding the plant was predominantly farms and woodland. Water from the Pripyat River was used to cool the reactors. As in most nuclear power plants, the reactor used at Chernobyl, the RBMK-1000, is now, however, well known to have a design flaw in the cooling system. On the 25th of April, plant operators were making preparations for a maintenance shutdown. In the early hours of the 26th, hot fuel rods were lowered into the cooling water, creating steam, and owing to that design flaw, a power surge caused an explosion, killing 2 plant workers. For the following few days, emergency crews attempted to contain the fires and radiation leaks. As more plant workers became exposed to the radiation, they later died of radiation sickness. But fortunately, most of the radiation leaked had a relatively short half-life of 8 days. A day after the event on the 27th of April 1986, the town of Pripyat was evacuated. Many of the town's people suffering headaches, vomiting, and other indications of radiation sickness. In the months following the event, 28 plant workers died, and this number grew to 31 after 3 months. In addition, over 6,000 cancer cases have been linked to the event. However, the true number of cases attributed to the event are near impossible to calculate, as people naturally suffer from various cancers. Many doctors in Eastern Europe advised pregnant women to abort their unborn children for fear of them bearing children with birth defects, although in hindsight the level of radiation exposure was probably too low to have caused any such complications. The trees in the surrounding woodland were killed from the radiation, and the region became known as the Red Forest, owing to the color the flora turned after the radiation exposure. The contaminated trees were torn down and buried in purpose-dug trenches. Shortly after the disaster, birds living in the area were found to have developed with smaller brains. Swallows in the area demonstrated albino plumage, deformed feet and tail feathers, and tumors. Some cattle born after the event exhibited signs of radioactive mutation. In 2011, though, the Ukraine opened up the area to tourists wishing to see firsthand the effects of the disaster. The region nowadays has become one of the world's most thriving wildlife sanctuaries, hosting thriving numbers of deer, wolves, boar, elk, bear, eagles, and other species scarcely found in other surrounding regions. Despite this recent explosion in fauna, experts predict that the area will not be fit for human habitation for another 20,000 years. Post-disaster, children seem to have been most affected in the form of a thyroid cancer outbreak.
caused by the absorption of iodine-131 into the thyroid gland in children in Ukraine and Belarus. Studies show that adults were less affected, and the children who were the youngest during the incident were most at risk. Before the event, the cases of thyroid cancer in Belarus were under 1 case per million people. By 1995, cases were up to 100 per million per year. Clearly, the nuclear event was to blame for this upswing. In West Germany, Down syndrome peaked for some 9 months, with a cluster of 12 cases born in January 1987. That may have been connected to the disaster. In 2006, a group of 8 UN agencies, including the World Health Organization and the International Atomic Energy Agency, along with hundreds of scientists and health experts, assessed the damage of the event. The number of fatalities has not reached the tens of thousands that were predicted shortly after the disaster. Fewer than 50 deaths have been directly attributed to the event. 9 children died of thyroid cancer thought to have been caused by the disaster. The report concluded that, by and large, we have not found profound negative health impacts on the rest of the population in surrounding areas, nor have we found widespread contamination that would continue to pose a substantial threat to human health. It's interesting to note that over 1,000 reactor staff were heavily exposed to radiation, and around 200,000 workers were involved in recovery operations, yet only 50 died from cancer 20 years later. But we aren't out of the woods yet. Scientists are divided in predicting the number of cancer deaths we can expect over the next 20 years, with a report suggesting that a further 4,000 people will die of cancer. The town of Pripyat is still considered uninhabitable, although popular with dark tourists who venture into the zone to see firsthand how the event changed the landscape. Radiation in large volumes kills living things, but amazingly the flora and fauna surrounding the plant have learned to thrive and in some cases benefit from the radiation. For example, a fungus exists that uses radiation to produce its own energy source, much the same way solar panels use sunlight. This radiotrophic fungi performs radiosynthesis using melanin pigment to convert gamma radiation into chemical energy growth. So while Chernobyl was undoubtedly a disastrous event, we have learned much about the dangers of nuclear radiation as a consequence, and hopefully this knowledge will help us understand nuclear energy better. So what do you think about the Chernobyl nuclear disaster? Was the event as terrible as what we first thought? Let us know in the comments. Also, be sure to watch our other video called "What Was It Like to Be Jailed at Alcatraz?" Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. See you next time.